Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. I'm James Anderson, and back in 2022, I decided to take my RV up to the remote stretches of the Porcupine Mountains in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. As a graphic designer, more acquainted with pixels than pine trees, I thought a solo trip might spark some creativity, or at least give me a funny story to tell at the next office party. I packed more gadgets than gear, thinking my tablet and a portable Wi-Fi hotspot would be enough to keep me connected. My buddies laughed, saying I'd be back within a day begging for a decent latte, but I was determined to prove them wrong. After all, how hard could camping be when your bed has wheels and there's a mini fridge stocked with craft beer? The drive was uneventful, save for the occasional deer darting across the winding roads. The autumn leaves painted the landscape in fiery hues, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of optimism. Maybe this nature thing wasn't so bad after all. I pulled into an isolated campground, the kind where you have to fill out a slip and drop it into a box because there's no ranger station. As I set up, a beat-up pickup truck rattled past, its driver giving me a long, scrutinizing stare. He was an older man with a weathered face, sporting a beard that could house a family of sparrows. I gave a friendly wave, but he just spat out the window and drove on. "Well, nice to meet you too," I muttered, shaking my head. Night fell quicker than I expected. I settled into my RV, flicking on the interior lights and firing up a movie on my tablet. Halfway through, the Wi-Fi cut out. Figures. I decided to step outside to get some fresh air. The silence was thick, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoots of owls. Taking a deep breath, I savored the crisp air when I noticed a faint glow deeper in the woods. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed my flashlight. This is how horror movies start, I joked to myself, but ventured forth anyway. As I approached, the glow sharpened into the flicker of a campfire. There, in a small clearing, stood a group of people in a circle, their faces obscured by hooded cloaks. Great, I've stumbled upon a cult meeting. Just my luck, I thought. I was about to back away slowly when one of them turned abruptly, revealing a pale face with sharp features. His eyes locked onto mine, and a sly grin spread across his lips. Well, looks like we have an unexpected guest," he called out. The others turned in unison, their gazes piercing through the darkness. "Sorry to intrude," I stammered. "I was just, enjoying a walk and saw your fire." "Join us," he said, motioning with a gloved hand. "We were just getting started." Every rational part of me screamed to leave, but politeness overrode common sense. "Sure, why not?" I said, walking into the clearing. The warmth of the fire did little to ease the chill crawling up my spine. Up close, their cloaks appeared tattered, and a strange symbol was stitched onto the fabric, a triangle entwined with a serpent. "We're celebrating the harvest," another member said, her voice smooth like honey, but with an unsettling undertone. "Cool. I didn't bring any snacks, though," I quipped, hoping humor might lighten the mood. "No matter," the leader replied. "We have plenty to share." They began chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The flames danced higher, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I glanced around, noticing that there were no tents or supplies, just the fire and the people. "Well, this has been fun, but I should probably head back," I said, taking a step backward. "Stay," the leader insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The ritual is incomplete without a proper offering." "Offering?" I laughed nervously. "I think I'll pass on that." Before I could turn, two members grabbed my arms with a grip stronger than their slender frames suggested. Panic surged through me. "Hey, let go!" The leader approached, pulling back his hood to reveal a bald head etched with scars forming the same symbol on their cloaks. "You stumbled upon us for a reason. The woods guide those who are meant to join." I struggled, but their hold tightened. "Look, I'm just a guy who got lost. I didn't see anything." "Precisely," he smiled. "You're nobody, a perfect vessel." They dragged me toward a makeshift altar, a flat stone slab stained dark. My heart pounded as adrenaline kicked in. In a burst of desperation, I stomped hard on the foot of the person to my right. He yelped, loosening his grip just enough for me to wrench free. Without thinking, I bolted into the woods. Branches whipped against my face as I ran blindly, the chants morphing into shouts behind me. My lungs burned, but fear propelled me forward. I could hear footsteps gaining, leaves crunching under heavy boots. "Help!" I screamed into the void, knowing full well that I was miles from anyone who could hear. Suddenly, a blinding light flooded the area. "Freeze! State police!" A voice boomed. The leader recoiled as officers emerged from all sides, weapons drawn. Stunned, I watched as they apprehended the cult members one by one. An officer helped me to my feet. "Are you okay?" I think so," I gasped. "How did you find me?" "We've been tracking this group for months," he explained. "Got a tip they were operating in this area." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A scream pierced the night, a guttural, inhuman wail that didn't seem possible from a human throat. "What was that?" I whispered. The officer's face paled. "Stay here." He moved toward the sound, hand hovering over his holster. Against better judgment, I followed at a distance. The officers converged on a clearing where they found a grisly scene. A shallow pit filled with bones, some animal, others unmistakably human. The remains were arranged in grotesque patterns, and the stench was overwhelming. One of the officers retched. "Looks like we found their dumping ground," another muttered grimly. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't just some harmless group of oddballs. They were killers. Maybe worse. The night stretched on as statements were taken and evidence collected. Eventually, they escorted me back to my RV. "We'll have someone keep an eye on you tonight," the officer assured me. "But you should be safe now." Safe, right? I nodded absently, still processing the night's events. Inside the RV, I locked every door and window, then double-checked them for good measure. Exhaustion hit me like a freight train, but sleep was a distant possibility. I sat at the small kitchenette table, nursing a cold beer, the kind of liquid courage that does nothing after the fact. Morning light seeped through the blinds, and with it came a knock on the door. I flinched but relaxed when I saw it was the officer from the night before. "Mind if we talk?" he asked. "Sure." I opened the door, and he stepped in, removing his hat. "We've identified the group's leader, named Silas Crowley," he said, flipping open a notebook. "Former anthropology professor who went off the grid after some controversial research." Controversial how? Obsession with ancient rituals, human sacrifices, the works. He attracted a following of like-minded individuals. We've been trying to pin him down for a while. A chill ran through me. "So I just stumbled into a homicidal maniac's backyard?" "Pretty much," he sighed. "You're lucky to be alive. Others weren't so fortunate." I swallowed hard, the reality settling in. "What happens now?" "Silas and his group are in custody. With your testimony, we can ensure they won't see the light of day for a long time." "Glad to hear it," I replied, meaning it. He gave a small nod. "If you remember anything else, give me a call." He handed me his card. After he left, I started packing up. The allure of the wilderness had lost its shine. As I secured the last of my gear, I noticed something tucked under the windshield wiper, a small folded piece of parchment. Heart pounding, I unfolded it to reveal a hand-drawn symbol. A triangle entwined with a serpent. Below it, scrawled in elegant script, were the words, "This isn't over." I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. Not willing to stick around to find out, I jumped into the driver's seat and fired up the engine. The RV roared to life, and I peeled out of the campsite faster than any posted speed limit would approve. The drive back was a blur. Every so often, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that beat-up pickup or a convoy of cloaked figures tailing me. But the road remained empty, save for the occasional semi-truck. Back in Chicago, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. I threw myself into work, using design projects as a distraction. But curiosity gnawed at me. Who exactly was Silas Crowley, and how had he managed to evade capture for so long? One night, unable to sleep, I dove into the depths of the internet. Articles, forum posts, and obscure websites painted a disturbing picture. Silas had been linked to mysterious disappearances across several states, always near remote areas. His followers were zealots, believing in some twisted form of immortality achieved through rituals involving unwitting participants. I came across a photo from an old university yearbook. There he was, clean-shaven, eyes sharp but not yet clouded by madness. A far cry from the scarred visage that haunted my memories. Beneath the photo was a list of his published works. One title stood out, Transcendence Through Sacrifice, an Anthropological Perspective. I clicked on a link leading to an abstract. It detailed ancient practices meant to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine, often requiring a human conduit. Chillingly, it argued that such rituals were not acts of barbarism, but profound spiritual endeavors. A notification popped up, a new email. Odd, considering the hour. The subject line read, "We will meet again." I hesitated before opening it. The message contained only a single image, the same symbol of the triangle and serpent. My stomach twisted. How did they find me? How did they find me? My mind raced. I hadn't given anyone my contact information, and the police assured me that all members were accounted for. Except perhaps they weren't. Determined not to be a sitting duck, I reached out to the officer who had helped me, Detective Marcus Lee. His number went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining the email and urged him to call me back. Days passed with no response. Then a news report caught my attention. Detective Marcus Lee had been found dead in his home, the victim of an apparent suicide. But the details didn't add up. No note, no history of depression, just a decorated officer who suddenly took his own life. I knew better. Feeling cornered, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't about to let these people control my life. If they wanted a game of cat and mouse, I'd show them I wasn't easy prey. I revisited the forums, digging deeper into the network of connections surrounding Silas. A pattern emerged. The locations of past rituals formed a rough circle on the map, with Chicago unsettlingly close to the center. Late one night, my apartment buzzer sounded. Cautiously, I approached the intercom. "Who is it?" No response, just static. Then a voice whispered, "Time to complete the ritual, James." Panic surged, but I steeled myself. "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing," I muttered. I hung up and grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the door, a relic from my high school days, more for nostalgia than anything else, but solid wood nonetheless. The hallway was quiet as I stepped out, scanning for any movement. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal a cloaked figure. Without waiting, I charged, swinging the bat with every ounce of fear and rage pent up inside me. The figure dodged, but not fast enough. The bat connected with a sickening thud, and he crumpled to the ground. I pulled back the hood to reveal a young man, eyes wide with shock. He wasn't Silas, but he wore the same symbol around his neck. Steps echoed from the stairwell. More were coming. I dashed back into my apartment, locking the door and wedging a chair under the handle. My mind raced. They weren't going to stop unless I stopped them. That's when an idea struck me. Rushing to my computer, I accessed the security system controls for the building, a perk of designing the software for the management company. I activated the fire alarm, triggering an automatic call to the fire department and unlocking all exit doors. Within minutes, the halls filled with blaring sirens and the stomping of residents evacuating. The cult members would be lost in the chaos, their anonymity stripped away. I joined the crowd heading downstairs, blending in. Outside, fire trucks arrived and firefighters began their sweep. I spotted a few cloaked figures slipping away into the night but didn't pursue them. The police arrived shortly after. I gave my statement, omitting certain details to avoid sounding like a lunatic. They assured me they'd investigate. Exhausted, I checked into a hotel under an alias. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by fragmented dreams. The next morning, a news alert pinged on my phone. Notorious cult leader Silas Crowley found dead in apparent ritual suicide. The article detailed how he was discovered in an abandoned warehouse surrounded by symbols and paraphernalia. A sense of relief washed over me, tempered by skepticism. It seemed too convenient. A knock at the door startled me. I peered through the peephole to see a woman in a business suit holding a badge. "Mr. Anderson, FBI, we need to talk." I opened the door cautiously. "How did you find me?" "We have our ways," she replied curtly. "May I come in?" I nodded, stepping aside. She sat down, fixing me with a piercing gaze. "Silas Crowley is dead, but his followers are still at large. We believe you're a target." "Tell me something I don't know," I sighed. We can offer you protection, but we need full cooperation." I considered her offer. "Fine, what do you need?" "Everything you know about the cult's operations, contacts you've made, any information that could help us dismantle what's left." For the next several hours, I recounted every detail, from the campsite to the emails. As I spoke, a thought nagged at me. If Silas is dead, who sent the email? She paused. That's what we're trying to figure out. His second in command, Lydia Marks, is just as dangerous, if not more. Great. So we're back to square one. Not entirely. With your help, we can set a trap. Use me as bait? She met my gaze steadily. Essentially. I leaned back, weighing my options. Running hadn't worked, and hiding was a temporary fix at best. All right, let's do it. Plans were set. I was to resume my normal life under surveillance. Days passed without incident. I almost began to believe the nightmare was over. Then, one evening, as I returned home, the lights flickered ominously. The air felt heavy. Showtime, I muttered. I entered cautiously. The living room was empty, but a faint sound came from the bedroom. A soft chanting. I signaled discreetly, hoping the agents were monitoring. Pushing the door open, I found Lydia standing by the window, silhouetted against the city lights. Welcome home, Donovan, she purred. Can't say I was expecting guests. She smiled coldly. Silas underestimated you. I won't make the same mistake. Funny, I was just thinking the same thing about you cult types. She stepped forward. Join us willingly, and your transition will be painless. Tempting, but I'll pass. She lunged, but before she could reach me, agents burst in, weapons drawn. Freeze! Lydia's eyes flashed with fury. In a swift motion, she pulled a knife from her sleeve. Shots rang out, and she collapsed, the blade clattering to the floor. As they secured the scene, I stood there, a whirlwind of emotions swirling but none taking hold. The agent from before approached. It's over, I nodded. Is it? She gave a half smile. For now. Weeks later, life settled into a new normal. The emails stopped and the surveillance was lifted. The FBI assured me the cult had been dismantled. One evening, as I sorted through my mail, I found an unmarked envelope. Inside was a photograph of Silas and Lydia standing in front of a farmhouse, with me in the background unaware. Scrawled on the back were the words, "See you soon." I stared at it, a mix of dread and resignation. Maybe the cycle wasn't broken, but at least I knew what I was up against. In that moment, I realized Silas Crowley wasn't just a man, but the embodiment of an idea, one that wouldn't die easily, but neither would I. My name is Michael Bennett, and this happened to me on October 17th, 2011. I had always been a big fan of camping, getting away from the chaos of city life and immersing myself in the quiet solitude of nature. That weekend, my friend Owen and I decided to head out to the Black Hills in South Dakota. We packed up my RV with enough supplies for a few days, including plenty of beer, some fishing gear, and enough junk food to last us a week. Owen and I had been friends since college, bonding over our love for the outdoors and our mutual disdain for cubicle life. We both worked in finance, a job that paid well, but sucked the soul right out of you. So these trips were our lifeline, a way to recharge and feel human again. This time we were aiming for a spot we'd heard about from a guy at the bar, deep in the hills, off the beaten path, and supposedly untouched by tourists. We rolled into the site just before sunset. It was perfect, an open clearing surrounded by dense forests with a clear stream running nearby. We parked the RV, set up camp, and cracked open a couple of beers. The first night was uneventful, just the way we liked it. We sat by the fire, talked about nothing in particular, and enjoyed the stars. The next morning, we decided to explore the area. We found a small trail that led deeper into the forest and followed it for a couple of miles until we came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The wood was rotting, the windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges. Naturally, Owen and I were curious, so we decided to take a look inside. The cabin was empty, except for a few pieces of broken furniture and a lot of dust. There were no signs that anyone had been there in years, so we didn't think much of it. We left and spent the rest of the day hiking, fishing, and generally enjoying the peace and quiet. That evening, back at the campsite, things started to get strange. It was just after dinner and we were sitting by the fire again when we heard a noise coming from the woods. At first, we thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sounds didn't fit. It was more like a scratching, followed by a low, almost guttural sound that I can't quite describe. Owen grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise. We didn't see anything, but the scratching continued, getting louder and closer. We both stood up, feeling a mix of curiosity and unease. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. We looked at each other, shrugged it off, and went back to our beers, chalking it up to the woods playing tricks on us. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I looked out the window, there was nothing there. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Owen and I decided to take it easy that day. We stayed close to the campsite, fishing in the stream and lounging around. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I didn't say anything to Owen, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I could tell he felt it too. He kept glancing into the woods, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a tense alertness. That evening, as we were cooking dinner, we heard the noise again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Owen grabbed his flashlight and a hunting knife we kept for emergencies. We moved slowly toward the edge of the clearing, the fire casting long shadows behind us. "Who's there?" Owen called out, his voice steady but with an edge of tension. There was no response, just the continued scratching and rustling. We took a few more steps, and then we saw it. Or rather, we saw the outline of it. Something large, hunched over, with limbs that looked too long for its body. It was just standing there, half hidden by the trees, watching us. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, more to myself than to Owen. "I don't know," he replied, gripping the knife tighter. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us daring to move. Then, in a flash, the thing was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. We backed up slowly, not taking our eyes off the spot where it had stood, and made our way back to the fire. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, my voice shaky. Owen shook his head. "No, not yet. Let's see what happens. It could just be some animal." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. We finished dinner in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. We decided to take turns keeping watch that night, just in case. Owen took the first shift while I tried to get some sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to Owen shaking me, his face pale. "It's back," he whispered, "and it's closer." I grabbed the flashlight and knife and followed him outside. The noise was louder now, more aggressive. We shone the light toward the sound and saw the creature again, closer this time, its eyes reflecting the light in an eerie glow. It moved slowly toward us, almost as if it was testing us. "Get in the RV," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We backed up slowly, keeping the light on the creature. It followed us, never breaking eye contact. We scrambled into the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it. The creature came right up to the door, scratching at it with long, sharp claws. We could hear its breathing, heavy and ragged, as it tried to get inside. "Start the engine," Owen said, his voice tight with fear. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from that thing. The RV lurched forward, and we sped down the narrow dirt road, the creature's silhouette disappearing in the rearview mirror. We drove for what felt like hours until we reached a small town. We pulled into a gas station and parked, both of us too shaken to speak. We sat there in silence for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. "Do you think it followed us?" Owen finally asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," I replied, my voice hoarse. "But I don't want to find out." We decided to call it quits on the camping trip and headed back home. The drive was long and tense, both of us constantly checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that thing following us. But we made it back without incident, and after a few days, the fear started to fade, replaced by a nagging sense of curiosity. What was that thing? Where did it come from? We never found out. We did some research, looking up local legends and folklore, but nothing matched what we saw. The closest we came was a story about a creature called Rolus, an ancient mythical beast said to haunt the forests. But that was just a story, right? Owen and I haven't been camping since. We still talk about that trip sometimes, trying to make sense of it, but we always come up short. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. All I know is that something is out there, something that defies explanation, and it's better to leave it alone. So if you ever find yourself in the Black Hills, remember this story. Stay on the beaten path. Don't go exploring old cabins, and if you hear strange noises in the night, get the hell out of there. You never know what might be watching you. My name is William Carter, and I'm 28 years old. I've always loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, being surrounded by the quiet beauty of nature. But what happened in the Monongahela National Forest last October changed the way I see the wilderness forever. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, a chance to reconnect with old friends and prove to myself that I could still find peace out there, even after everything I'd been through. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. It started as a casual idea during a group chat. Ryan Morales, my best friend from college, suggested we tackle an unmarked trail near Crum Knob. Breathtaking views, barely anyone around, he'd said. That was all Ryan needed to hear, an adventure far off the beaten path. Lila Barnes, the mediator of our trio, had been hesitant but relented. She was the sensitive type, a believer in energy and spirits, but she loved the idea of spending time with us. And me? I just wanted to prove I wasn't afraid anymore. The morning we arrived, the trailhead was everything Ryan had promised. Isolated and overgrown, the kind of place most people wouldn't bother with. I double-checked my gear, a good sleeping bag, weatherproof tent, high-powered flashlight, and enough food to last us longer than we planned to stay. Ryan, of course, had packed light. Too light. You brought that? I said, eyeing his flimsy-looking sleeping bag. It's fine, William Carter, he replied with a grin. I'm not planning to freeze to death. Lila rolled her eyes. You're going to complain the whole time, aren't you? We set off late morning, the sun filtering through the dense canopy of the forest. At first, everything felt normal. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the breeze, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. The trail was rough, but I'd expected that. What I didn't expect was how quickly the atmosphere would change. By mid-afternoon, we were deep in the woods, and the familiar sounds of nature started to fade. The birds stopped singing. The trees, once so vibrant, seemed darker, almost menacing. Even the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. Lila was the first to mention it. Does it feel quieter to you guys? She asked, her voice tinged with unease. Ryan laughed it off. It's just the wind dying down. Don't psych yourself out. I wanted to believe him, but something about the silence wasn't natural. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As the day wore on, the trail became harder to follow. Signs of human passage disappeared, replaced by thick underbrush and moss-covered rocks. My map was useless. Ryan teased me about overthinking, but when we came across a weathered wooden sign with the words, "Turn back," barely legible beneath layers of grime, even he fell silent. It's probably just a joke, he said after a moment. Someone trying to scare off hikers. Lila shook her head. Feels like a warning. Despite my growing unease, I didn't want to back out. I needed to finish this hike to prove to myself that I could handle it. So we pressed on. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the forest grew colder and darker. That night, we set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. Ryan got the fire going while Lila and I prepared our tents. As we settled in for the night, the usual camaraderie returned. We joked, ate, and shared stories around the fire. For a moment, it felt like old times until we heard the scream. It came from deep in the woods, a shrill, piercing cry that froze me in place. Lila's face went pale, and Ryan stood up, flashlight in hand. Probably an animal, he said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. No animal makes a sound like that, Lila whispered. We listened, straining to hear anything over the crackling of the fire. For a long moment there was nothing, then faintly I heard it, someone calling my name. William. It was a soft, lilting voice, barely audible but unmistakable. My stomach churned. It sounded like my brother Nate. He died when I was 16, lost in the woods during a family camping trip. I knew it couldn't be him, but the voice was so eerily familiar. Did you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Ryan said, scanning the trees with his flashlight. It said my name, I insisted. It sounded like. Before I could finish, Ryan's light flickered and died. Damn things out of batteries, he muttered. We retreated to our tents after that, but sleep didn't come easily. The sounds outside, branches snapping, faint whispers, kept me awake. I gripped my flashlight tightly, my heart pounding with every noise. The next morning, we discovered something strange. Around our campsite were large footprints, almost human, but with elongated toes and a strange, claw-like shape at the end. They circled the fire pit and disappeared into the woods. Ryan tried to laugh it off, calling it a prank, but Lila and I weren't so sure. As we packed up to leave, the forest felt even more hostile. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, and the oppressive silence followed us. Then, around noon, we heard it again. Someone calling for help. "Ryan!" The voice was desperate, pleading. "That's me," Ryan said, stopping in his tracks. "No, it's not," Lila snapped. "You're right here. That's not you." The voice called out again, closer this time. Ryan, always the skeptic, marched toward the sound despite our protests. He disappeared into the trees, leaving Lila and me alone on the trail. Minutes passed. Then an hour. When he finally returned, something about him was off. His skin was pale, his eyes distant. He spoke little, his usual confidence replaced by an eerie calm. Lila and I exchanged worried glances, but didn't press him. Not yet. As night fell, the tension between us grew. Lila whispered to me that she'd seen Ryan standing outside her tent the night before, staring into the woods. "I don't think it's him," she said, her voice shaking. "I think it's something else." I wanted to dismiss her fear as paranoia, but when Ryan spoke, his voice sounded wrong. There was a guttural edge to it, something not quite human. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. Was he possessed? Was I imagining things? The next day, everything unraveled. Ryan's behavior grew stranger. He refused to eat, instead watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. At one point, he muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't understand, but that sent a chill down my spine. Lila was the first to snap. "You're not Ryan," she said, backing away from him. "What are you?" He laughed, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. "You don't want to know." That was the moment I knew we had to leave. But Ryan, or whatever he'd become, wasn't going to let us go easily. As we packed, he stood between us and the trail, his grin stretching impossibly wide. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. "You can't leave," he said. "Not yet." When he lunged, I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the canister of fuel from my pack and hurled it at him, igniting it with my lighter. Flames roared to life, spreading quickly through the dry brush. Ryan, or the thing wearing his face, shrieked and stumbled backward, disappearing into the inferno. Lila and I ran, the fire spreading behind us, consuming everything in its path. By the time we reached the trailhead, we were covered in soot and barely able to stand. Ryan was gone. We reported him missing, but no trace of him was ever found. Weeks later, I received a voicemail from his number. His voice, distorted and filled with static, whispered my name. "William, come back." I deleted it, but the memory lingers. The forest isn't just a place of beauty and solitude. It has its own rules, its own predators, and some things should never be found. I was just about ready to call it a day when I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. My name is Jonathan Vickers, and I pride myself on having a pretty good sense of direction. But on this occasion, I found myself completely disoriented. I was in the backwoods of West Virginia, a place where GPS signals die, and cell phone service is a myth. What was supposed to be a scenic drive through the Appalachian Mountains had turned into an unexpected detour into an isolated, dense forest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The deeper I drove, the narrower and rougher the path became until it was barely wide enough for my car. I decided it was time to turn around and head back to the main road. But as I began to maneuver a 3-point turn, the car suddenly lurched and stalled. The engine refused to restart. I cursed under my breath and got out to see what was wrong. The right front tire was flat. A jagged rock had punctured it. "Great, just great," I muttered, kicking the tire in frustration. With no spare tire and no cell service, I had no choice but to set out on foot in search of help. I grabbed a flashlight and my jacket from the car, hoping I'd come across a house or cabin where I could call for assistance. The forest was eerily silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. The towering trees closed in around me, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dark canopy. After what felt like hours of walking, I saw a dim light flickering through the trees. I quickened my pace, my hope rekindled. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, revealing an old, dilapidated cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint smell of cooking meat wafted through the air. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open to reveal a wiry man with a scruffy beard and sunken eyes. "Evenin'," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "What brings you out here?" I explained my predicament, and he nodded slowly, sizing me up with a wary eye. "You're welcome to come in and use the phone," he said, stepping aside. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by a kerosene lamp. The furniture was sparse and crude, a mismatched collection of old chairs and a rickety table. The man introduced himself as Earl. He led me to a phone mounted on the wall, but when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. "Line's been down for a while," Earl said, "but you can stay here for the night. Ain't safe to be wandering these woods after dark." With little choice, I accepted his offer. Earl handed me a bowl of stew, which I ate hungrily, though it tasted off, like the meat was a bit too gamey. As we talked, Earl mentioned his family lived nearby. "We're a close-knit bunch, been living here for generations." I nodded politely, trying to mask my unease. Something about the place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Why don't you get some rest?" Earl suggested. "I'll take you to town in the morning." He led me to a small, windowless room with a cot and a thin blanket. As I lay down, the exhaustion of the day's events began to weigh on me. My eyelids grew heavy and I drifted off to sleep despite my discomfort. I awoke to the sound of low voices and the unmistakable creak of floorboards. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The voices were muffled but grew clearer as they approached my room. Instinctively, I reached for the flashlight, gripping it tightly as a makeshift weapon. The door swung open, and in the dim light, I saw Earl standing there with two others. One was a large, hulking man with a thick neck and a permanent scowl. The other was a woman with matted hair and a sinister grin. "Time to move," Earl said, his voice devoid of the previous friendliness. "What's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Just a little family tradition," the woman replied with a twisted smile. "You're the guest of honor." Before I could react, the large man lunged at me, grabbing my arms with a vice-like grip. I struggled and fought, but he was too strong. They dragged me out of the room and down a narrow hallway, my flashlight clattering to the floor. I was brought into a large, dimly lit room that reeked of decay. The walls were lined with crude wooden cages, some of which contained skeletal remains. A makeshift altar stood in the center, stained with dried blood. My stomach churned with fear and revulsion. Earl and the woman began chanting in a low, guttural language as the large man tied me to the altar. I thrashed against the ropes, but they held fast. Panic surged through me as I realized their intentions. They were going to kill me. In a desperate bid for survival, I recalled the small pocket knife I always carried. With trembling fingers, I managed to reach into my jacket and flick open the blade. As Earl raised a rusty knife above me, I slashed at the ropes binding my wrists. The rope gave way, and I rolled off the altar just as Earl brought the knife down, the blade sinking into the wooden surface with a dull thud. I scrambled to my feet, brandishing the pocket knife. The large man lunged at me again, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped his charge and drove the knife into his side. He roared in pain and staggered back, clutching the wound. The woman screamed and lunged at me with wild fury. I dodged her attack, kicking her legs out from under her. She fell to the ground with a grunt. Earl came at me next, the rusty knife slashing through the air. I parried with my pocket knife, the blades clashing in a spark of metal. Summoning every ounce of strength and resolve, I fought them off, landing blows and dodging their attacks. Bloody and battered, I managed to break free and sprint for the door. I burst out of the cabin and into the night, the cold air stinging my lungs. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping against my face, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound of pursuit faded behind me, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. Exhausted and disoriented, I finally stumbled upon a rural road. A passing truck slowed down as I waved frantically. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, pulled over and helped me into the cab. I explained what had happened, my voice trembling with the weight of the ordeal. The man nodded grimly and drove me to the nearest police station. The authorities took my statement and organized a search party to investigate the cabin. It didn't take long for them to find the gruesome evidence of Earl's family tradition. The police arrested Earl and his accomplices. The investigation revealed they were part of an inbred, cannibalistic clan that had been preying on lost travelers for decades. The skeletal remains found in the cages were identified as missing persons from as far back as the 1980s. The horror of that night will stay with me forever, but I refuse to let it define me. The authorities ensured that Earl and his family would never harm anyone again. After giving my final statement to the police, I thanked the officer and walked out into the daylight. The fresh air filled my lungs, and I knew I had survived something unimaginable. As I left the station, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that it was finally over. My name is David Dawson, and this story happened to me in the summer of 2008. I was a camp counselor at Camp Pinewood, nestled in the heart of the Adirondacks. I've always loved the outdoors, and this job was my dream gig, spending the summer hiking, canoeing, and hanging out with kids. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, so the woods felt like home. Plus, I needed the extra cash to help pay for my college tuition. Little did I know that this summer would be anything but ordinary. Camp Pinewood had been around since the 1920s, a sprawling piece of land with cabins, a mess hall, and a big lake where we taught the kids to swim and canoe. It was a beautiful place, full of towering pines and the smell of fresh pine needles. The camp was split into boys and girls sections, each with its own set of counselors. I was in charge of Cabin 6, a group of 12-year-old boys who were more interested in causing mischief than anything else. My fellow counselors were a mixed bunch. There was Cody, who was a year older than me and acted like he owned the place. Jenny, the arts and crafts counselor with a perpetual smile, and Andy, the quiet guy who played guitar by the campfire every night. We were a tight-knit group, and after the kids went to bed, we'd sit around, share stories, drink a couple of beers we kept hidden, and just enjoy the calm of the forest night. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of wrangling the kids through a hike up to Lookout Point, we gathered around the fire. The stars were out in full force, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Andy started strumming his guitar, playing a soft tune that made the woods feel even more magical. As we were talking, Cody mentioned something about the old stories the local townsfolk used to tell. "They say these woods are haunted, you know," he said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Haunted?" Jenny scoffed. "By what? Ghosts of campers who didn't clean their cabins?" "Nah," Cody replied, leaning in. "There's this old legend about a hermit who used to live around here. They say he went crazy, started kidnapping people and taking them to his cabin deep in the woods. No one ever found the cabin, though." I laughed, shaking my head. "Come on, Cody, you expect us to believe that? Sounds like a story you tell to scare the new counselors." Andy stopped playing his guitar and looked up. "I've heard that story too. My grandpa used to tell it to me when I was a kid. He swore it was true." We all sat in silence for a moment, the crackling fire the only sound. Then Jenny broke the tension with a laugh. "Well, if I see any hermits tonight, I'll be sure to ask for directions to his cabin." The next few days went by without incident. We kept the kids busy with activities and didn't think much about Cody's story. But then, weird things started happening. It began with small stuff: tools missing from the shed, food disappearing from the mess hall. At first, we thought it was just the kids playing pranks. But then one night, one of the girls from Cabin 3 went missing. Her name was Lila, a sweet kid, a bit on the shy side. Her bunkmates said they saw her go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, but she never came back. We searched the entire camp, calling her name, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of her. By dawn, we had to call the local authorities. The police showed up. Just a couple of officers with stern faces and serious attitudes. They combed the area and asked us a million questions, but they didn't find anything either. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The camp directors decided to keep the camp running, hoping Lila would turn up, but the atmosphere had changed. The kids were on edge, and so were we. At night, the woods seemed darker, the sounds more ominous. We kept a closer eye on our campers, never letting them wander off alone. A few nights later, I was on night duty, making sure the boys were asleep and everything was in order. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a rustling noise, like someone moving through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cabin, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. "Who's there?" I called out, shining the light around. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The noise had stopped. I stood there for a minute, listening, but all I could hear was the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. I was about to head back inside when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, barely there for a second, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The next morning, I told Cody and the others about it. They were skeptical, but Cody seemed intrigued. "Maybe it's the hermit," he said with a grin. "Or maybe Lila." "Not funny, Cody," Jenny snapped. "This is serious. We need to figure out what's going on." We decided to set up a watch system, taking turns staying up at night to keep an eye on things. It was exhausting, but we didn't want to take any chances. The kids needed to be safe. One night, it was my turn again. I was sitting by the fire, the only light in the darkness, when I heard it, the same rustling noise from before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure hunched over, moving slowly through the trees. I shone the light on it, and for a brief moment I saw a face, wild eyes, unkempt hair, and a look of sheer madness. Then it was gone, disappearing into the darkness. I ran back to the cabin, my mind racing. I knew I had to tell the others. We needed to find this person, whoever they were, and make sure they didn't harm anyone else. The next day, we organized a search party. The police were already involved, but we couldn't just sit around and wait. Cody, Andy, and I, along with a couple of other counselors, headed into the woods, determined to find the source of the strange occurrences. We split up into pairs, each taking a different direction. Andy and I headed east, following a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The farther we went, the quieter it got, the sounds of the camp fading away. After about an hour of walking, we stumbled upon something that made my stomach churn. An old, dilapidated cabin, hidden behind a thick curtain of vines and moss. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, but there were fresh footprints in the dirt leading up to the door. Andy and I exchanged a glance. "This has to be it," he whispered. We approached cautiously, our flashlights illuminating the decaying wood and broken windows. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the smell of rot and mildew. As we stepped inside, our flashlights revealed a scene straight out of a nightmare. Old furniture covered in dust, walls lined with strange symbols and drawings, and in the corner, a pile of clothes and blankets that looked like a makeshift bed. And then we saw her, Lila. She was lying on the floor, pale and unmoving. My heart sank. We rushed to her side, but it was too late. She was gone. We heard a noise behind us and turned to see the figure from the woods standing in the doorway, a crazed look in his eyes. He was holding a knife, his hand shaking as he stared at us. "Why did you come here?" he snarled. "This is my home. You shouldn't have come here." Andy and I backed away slowly, trying to keep our distance from the man. "We don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We just want to leave." But the man didn't listen. He lunged at us, the knife glinting in the flashlight beam. Andy managed to dodge out of the way, but I wasn't so lucky. The knife caught me in the arm, and I cried out in pain. Andy grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor and swung it at the man, hitting him in the side. The man stumbled, giving us a chance to make a run for it. We bolted out of the cabin, our hearts pounding as we raced back toward the camp. When we finally made it back, we were out of breath and covered in sweat. We told the others what had happened, and the police were called in immediately. They found the cabin and the man, who turned out to be a local who had gone off the grid years ago. He was arrested and taken away, but the damage had already been done. The camp was shut down early that summer. The parents were notified and the kids were sent home. It was a somber end to what was supposed to be a fun and carefree time. Lila's family was devastated, and the rest of us were left with the haunting memories of what had happened. I still think about that summer sometimes, especially when I'm out in the woods. The forest doesn't feel as safe as it used to, and I can't shake the image of that man's wild eyes. But life goes on. I'm back in college now, studying to be a teacher. Maybe one day I'll work at a camp again, but for now, I'm content to stick to the classroom. As for Camp Pinewood, it's still there, abandoned and overgrown. Some say it's haunted by Lila's spirit, but I don't believe in ghosts. What happened that summer was real, and that's enough to keep me away. Looking back, I realize how close we all came to a far worse outcome. It makes me appreciate the little things more, like a quiet night or a simple walk in the park. Life is fragile, and it can change in an instant. But it also goes on, and we have to find a way to move forward, no matter how dark the past might be. My name is John Evans. I'm 36, and last fall I found myself stranded in the heart of Canaan Mountain backcountry, West Virginia, battling something I still can't fully explain. I'm a mechanic by trade, a pragmatist by nature, and I've always believed there's a rational explanation for everything. That belief was shattered on the coldest night of my life. This trip was supposed to be my victory lap. I'd spent over a year restoring a beat-up 1978 Winnebago RV, and when I turned the key and heard the engine roar to life for the first time, it felt like conquering a mountain. The Canaan Mountain wilderness seemed like the perfect place to test it. Isolated, rugged, and breathtaking, the backcountry offered me a chance to be alone with my thoughts and prove the RV could handle the toughest terrain. The first 2 hours of the drive were smooth. The roads narrowed as I climbed higher, with a dense forest pressing in from both sides. The GPS lost its signal halfway up, but I had my trusty map and compass. I wasn't worried. By late afternoon, I'd found a clearing off a dirt road where I could park the RV and set up camp. The air was crisp, the light golden as it filtered through the trees. It felt perfect. I spent the evening cooking dinner over a campfire, enjoying the solitude. The world felt far away, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. By the time I climbed into the RV to sleep, the fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was silent. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, a stillness so complete it feels unnatural. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't the wind nor the creak of the RV settling. It was softer, whispers, low and indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. My first thought was animals, maybe raccoons or coyotes. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was still. Too still. No insects, no rustling leaves, just the faintest echo of the whispers slipping through the air like smoke. I shook my head, muttered something about overactive imaginations, and went back inside, but I couldn't sleep. Morning broke cold and gray, with a thick mist curling through the trees. I shrugged off the night's unease and decided to explore. I laced up my boots, grabbed my compass, and headed into the forest, following a faint trail that wound deeper into the wilderness. About an hour in, I stumbled across something strange, an old crumbling stone cabin hidden beneath a canopy of gnarled trees. The roof had long since collapsed and moss clung to the walls. Inside, I found a rusted metal kettle, shattered glass bottles, and a small leather journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but I could still make out fragments of the writing. It belonged to a man named Amos in the 1800s, and the entries detailed his encounters with what he called the Witch of Canaan Mountain. Amos claimed the witch was a reclusive woman accused of witchcraft by settlers who later killed her. Before her death, she cursed the mountain, vowing that anyone who disrespected it would suffer her wrath. I laughed to myself. Classic Appalachian folklore. People loved their ghost stories, but I couldn't shake a lingering unease as I left the cabin and made my way back to the RV. By the time I returned, the mist had thickened, and the RV looked eerie in the fading light. I climbed inside, feeling a strange chill that wasn't just from the weather. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. My compass was spinning wildly, the needle refusing to settle. I sat at the table, trying to calm my nerves when I heard it again, the whispers. This time they were louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all directions surrounding the RV. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside. I scanned the clearing, my breath fogging in the cold air, but there was no one there. Then I saw it. A pile of stones neatly stacked in a triangle sitting a few feet from the RV. I hadn't put it there, and I was certain it wasn't there before. My stomach tightened, but I told myself someone was probably messing with me. A prank or some local superstition. I kicked the pile over and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That was a mistake. That night, everything went wrong. It started with the RV. The heater cut out first, then the lights flickered and died. When I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't even turn over. I checked the battery, the fuel line, everything I could think of, but there was no logical explanation. It was as if the RV itself had been drained of life. As I worked, the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't just outside anymore. They were inside, echoing in the walls, the floor, the cabinets. My tools began to move. I'd set a wrench down, only to find it on the other side of the RV seconds later. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow move across the window. I froze. It wasn't human. I couldn't stay inside. The RV felt suffocating, alive with unseen malice. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the night, determined to find the source of the whispers. The forest was alive with movement, shadows flitting between the trees just beyond the edge of the light. I found myself drawn back to the stone cabin, as if some unseen force was guiding me. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of overlapping voices. When I reached the clearing, the hunched figure of a woman stood in the doorway of the cabin. She wasn't human. Her skin was pale and stretched taut, her eyes hollow voids that seemed to pull the light from the air. Her voice, if it could even be called that, was a low, rasping hiss. "You have trespassed," she said, though her mouth didn't move. The words echoed in my mind. "You have disrespected this place." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground. She raised a skeletal hand, and the whispers surged, each voice filled with anger and pain. I saw flashes, images of settlers, the burning cabin, the witch's death. I felt her rage, her sorrow, her unrelenting need for vengeance. She offered me a choice: leave behind something of great value to appease her, or be trapped on the mountain forever. My heart pounded as I realized what she meant. My RV, my pride and joy, the project I'd poured everything into for over a year. She wanted me to destroy it. I tried to reason with her, to beg, but her form began to dissolve, the shadows closing in. I ran back to the RV, the whispers and shadows following me. I grabbed a can of fuel and a lighter, tears streaming down my face as I doused the RV in gasoline. When I struck the match, it felt like I was burning a part of myself. The fire roared, lighting up the clearing. The whispers faded, the shadows retreating as the flames consumed the RV. For the first time in hours, the forest was silent. By morning, the fire had burned itself out, leaving only the charred remains of my RV. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. I gathered what little I could carry and followed the trail back to civilization. This time, the path was clear. I've told this story to a few people since then, but no one believes me. They chalk it up to isolation, exhaustion, or my own imagination. But I know what I saw, what I heard. I left a part of myself on Canaan Mountain that night, and I'm not sure I'll ever get it back. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the whispers. I'd always thought that road trips were a great way to clear my head. Growing up in Chicago, I'd gotten used to the bustling noise and constant movement, but sometimes I needed to escape the chaos and find a bit of peace. That's why I found myself driving through the remote backroads of West Virginia. My name is Byron Chadwick, and I was looking for a bit of solitude. I guess I found more than I'd bargained for. The trip had started out fine. I'd left Chicago at the crack of dawn with the goal of reaching a quaint little town called Harper's Ferry by sunset. The roads were winding, and my old Chevy's radio only picked up static, but the silence was welcome. I was deep into the countryside by noon, surrounded by thick forests and the occasional farm. The GPS on my phone had been working fine until I hit a particularly dense part of the forest. That's when the signal dropped. No big deal, I thought. I downloaded the map earlier. I could navigate without a problem. But then I took a wrong turn, and another. Before I knew it, I was completely off course. I wasn't too worried. These things happened. I just had to find my way back to the main road. As I drove deeper into the forest, the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that made the scenery even more eerie. I decided to stop and ask for directions at the next house I saw. That's when I came across an old, dilapidated farmhouse. It looked abandoned, but there was a light on inside. I pulled up the driveway and killed the engine. The place gave off an unsettling vibe, but I was out of options. I walked up to the door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with a gaunt face and unkempt hair. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah, I'm lost," I replied. "Can you tell me how to get back to the main road?" He stared at me for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, I'll get you a map." I hesitated but stepped inside. The house was dark and smelled musty, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. The man disappeared into another room, leaving me alone in the dimly lit hallway. As I waited, I heard a faint noise coming from the basement. It sounded like a whimper. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved toward the sound, finding a door that led to the basement. I opened it slowly, the creaking hinges echoing in the quiet house. The smell hit me first, rotting flesh and decay. I gagged, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I descended the stairs, the darkness enveloping me as I went deeper. The whimpering grew louder, more desperate. I reached the bottom and flicked on the light switch. The sight that met me was like something out of a nightmare. There were cages, rusty and old, lining the walls. Inside them were people, emaciated, dirty, and terrified. Some were unconscious, others were crying softly. My heart pounded in my chest. What the hell was going on here? Before I could react, I felt a heavy blow to the back of my head. I collapsed to the ground, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the man standing over me, a sinister grin on his face. I woke up in one of the cages, my head throbbing. I tried to move, but my hands and feet were bound. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. I wasn't just lost anymore, I was a prisoner. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time seemed to blur together in that dark, stinking basement. The other captives were too weak to speak, their spirits broken. I knew I had to get out of there, but I needed a plan. One day, the man came down with his family. 2 men and a woman, all as twisted and deranged as he was. They carried knives and machetes, their intentions clear. They'd come to take one of us to do God knows what. I watched in horror as they dragged a young woman out of her cage, her screams piercing the silence. The door was left ajar, a small sliver of hope. I waited until they were distracted, then used all my strength to break free of my bindings. My wrists bled as I worked the rope loose, but I didn't care. I had to move fast. I slipped out of the cage and made my way to the door. The family was busy with their sick ritual, giving me just enough time to sneak past them. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding, adrenaline fueling my every step. Once outside, I sprinted to my car, praying it would start. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back. I drove until I found a gas station, bursting through the door and begging the clerk to call the police. The authorities arrived quickly, and I led them back to the farmhouse. What they found there was enough to make seasoned officers turn pale. The basement was a scene of utter horror, but the captives were rescued, and the family was arrested. I learned later that the farmhouse had been abandoned for years before that twisted family moved in. They had been preying on travelers, people who wouldn't be missed. I was lucky to escape with my life. The police took my statement, and I was free to go. I got back into my car, the relief washing over me as I drove away from that hellish place. The road stretched out before me, a promise of safety and normalcy. The farmhouse was demolished, its dark history buried beneath the rubble. The captives were taken to the hospital, and I went back to Chicago, grateful to be alive. I never took a road trip again. Writing is supposed to be therapeutic, or so they all say. Pour your soul into your work, my therapist advised, as if putting my existential dread into words would magically fix my life. I believed her, at least for a while, but months had passed, and the words never came. So here I was, parked in the middle of nowhere in Tar Hollow State Forest, my RV nestled under a canopy of towering oaks. I'd heard about this place in passing, a quiet retreat for hikers and campers, but it was the stories about Devil's Bridge that intrigued me. Folklore, tragedy, and a cursed crossing, it had the makings of something special, maybe even the inspiration I needed to finish my novel. The bridge wasn't far from my campsite, about a 15-minute walk through a narrow trail. On my first evening, I made the trek, camera in hand, eager to find the supposed hotspot for ghost stories. The path twisted through the forest, late afternoon light filtering through the leaves. It felt serene at first, almost too quiet. Then I saw it, a crumbling stone bridge spanning a sluggish creek. The air around it felt heavier somehow, the silence deafening. As I approached, I noticed the water beneath the bridge reflected the trees above, but something was off. The reflection shimmered strangely, warping like heat waves on asphalt. I snapped a few pictures and recorded some video narrating for my own benefit. "This is the infamous Devil's Bridge," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. "Said to be cursed, haunted by a grieving woman who..." A splash cut me off. The water rippled, though nothing had fallen in. I peered closer, but the creek was as empty as it had been a moment ago. "Just the wind," I told myself, though my pulse quickened. I was probably letting the stories get to me. Still, as I walked back to the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was rain, but it wasn't coming from the roof. It was faint and rhythmic, dripping water. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The noise seemed to come from outside, near the creek. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped into the cool night air. The forest was cloaked in darkness, the trees barely outlined against the faint glow of the crescent moon. The dripping sound was louder now, drawing me toward the bridge. When I arrived, I saw her. She stood in the middle of the bridge, her back to me. She was dressed in white, the fabric fluttering faintly even though there was no breeze. Her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed, and a soft sobbing reached my ears. I froze, every rational part of me screaming to turn back, but something about her, about the way she cried, pulled me forward. "Ma'am?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Are you okay?" Her sobbing stopped. She turned slowly, her movements fluid but unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to drink in the light. She opened her mouth, but the sound that came out wasn't a cry. It was a whisper carried on the wind. "Help me!" I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The reflection in the creek caught my eye. Her figure was there, but so was something else. A shadow loomed behind me in the water's surface, tall and formless, its shape flickering like smoke. I ran. The next morning, I drove into town, desperate for answers. At a small diner, I struck up a conversation with the locals, asking about the bridge. Most of them avoided eye contact, muttering about it being bad luck. But one man, a retired sheriff named Andrews, finally spoke up. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, his tone grim. I nodded. "Who is she?" "Legend says she was a mother who lost her child in that creek, drowned, they say. She followed not long after, but she's no grieving mother now." He leaned closer. "The stories say she made a deal with something dark. Now she's cursed to guard that bridge, trapping anyone who gets too close." I laughed nervously, though my gut told me he wasn't joking. "And the shadow I saw?" Andrews shook his head. "No one knows what that is. Some say it's the devil himself. Others think it's the souls she's taken. Best advice I can give you is to pack up and leave. That bridge doesn't let people go easily." I should have listened. Instead, I returned to the bridge that afternoon, unable to help myself. Something about it drew me in, as if it held the key to my creative block. Or maybe something deeper. Something darker. This time I noticed symbols carved into the stones near the bridge. Intricate spirals and jagged lines seemed to pulse if I stared too long. The air grew colder, and the water's reflection twisted again, showing not just the trees but faint images of faces. They flickered like static on an old TV, their mouths moving soundlessly. The shadow was there too, in the water. It moved unnaturally, stretching toward me. I backed away and nearly tripped over a small, overgrown path. It led deeper into the forest, the underbrush thick and uninviting. I don't know why I followed it, curiosity maybe, or the faint hope of finding answers. The path ended at a dilapidated shack, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the wood in frantic, uneven lines. Words like cursed and marked jumped out at me, along with the name Watcher. On a small, rotting table sat a mirror. I stepped closer, drawn to the glass, but when I looked into it, my reflection wasn't my own. My eyes glowed red and my face was twisted in agony. Behind me, the shadow loomed, closer than ever. I fled back to the RV, but the unease stayed with me. That night, the sobbing returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. The woman appeared outside my window, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She mouthed the words, "Help me." But I knew better now. I stayed inside, gripping a knife I'd brought from the kitchen. The RV shook slightly, as if something was pushing against it, testing its strength. The mark on my arm burned, a symbol I hadn't noticed before, etched into my skin like the carvings on the bridge. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up and started the engine, but the RV wouldn't move. The wheels spun uselessly, as if the forest itself was holding me in place. Desperation clawed at me, and I found myself back at the bridge, drawn by some invisible force. The woman stood waiting, her form shifting like a mirage. "You have to help me," she said, her voice both pleading and commanding. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. She stepped closer, her face twisting into something monstrous. "Your soul," she whispered. The shadow surged from the creek, wrapping around me like smoke. My vision blurred, and for a moment I was underwater, the weight of the darkness pulling me down. Just when I thought I would drown, a new presence emerged. The Watcher. It stood between me and the woman, its form still shadowy, but somehow less menacing. It raised a hand and the woman shrieked, her figure dissolving into the air. The shadow around me loosened its grip, and I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. When I opened my eyes, the bridge was gone, collapsed into the creek as if it had never existed. I left Tar Hollow that day, abandoning my RV and most of my belongings. Even now, far from the forest, I feel the mark on my arm, a burning reminder of what I faced. The mirror in my hotel room reflects something different now. My eyes are darker and my face gaunt, and at night I still hear her voice. "Help me." The forest around Salt Fork State Park stretched endlessly, trees rising like sentinels into the autumn sky. I parked my RV in the last open spot near the lake, eager for solitude and inspiration. My plan was simple: a week of hiking, photographing the changing leaves, and maybe rediscovering the piece of myself I'd lost over the past year. The first 2 days were peaceful. The trails were stunning, each turn revealing new bursts of color. The air was crisp and invigorating, and I felt alive in a way I hadn't since leaving my corporate job. But by the third day, a creeping unease settled over me. I first noticed it at the bait shop near the lake. An older man named Dave struck up a conversation while I was buying a map. He had leathery skin and a fisherman's easy grin, but his tone turned serious when he asked where I was staying. "Out by the lake," I said, "near Hosak's cave." He frowned, shaking his head. "Be careful out there. There's a reason people don't camp alone in these parts." "Why's that?" I asked. "They say a hermit lives in those woods, been there for decades, long after he went mad. Some folks think he's more than just a man now. The forest does strange things to people." I laughed it off, but his words stuck with me. That night, I lay awake in the RV, the wind rattling the trees outside. Every creak and groan of the RV's frame sounded unnaturally loud. Once, I swore I heard footsteps crunching the gravel outside. But when I peeked out the window, the campsite was empty. The next morning, I set out early with my camera, determined to shake the lingering fear. The forest was beautiful under the morning sun, golden light streaming through the canopy. I snapped dozens of photos, dew on spiderwebs, the jagged bark of oaks, the reflection of the lake's glassy surface. I hiked toward Hosak's cave around midday. The trail was steeper than I anticipated, winding through thick brush. I almost missed the entrance, a dark slash in the rock face, barely visible beneath the moss. Stepping closer, I saw strange carvings etched into the stone, spirals and stick figures, deeply grooved but weathered with age. I snapped a picture, though something about the symbols unsettled me. As I turned to leave, movement caught my eye. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. He was gaunt, his clothes tattered and hanging loosely from his frame. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. "Hello," I called. My voice echoed. He didn't respond, just stared. I slung my camera over my shoulder and backed away, my heart pounding. When I glanced back a moment later, he was gone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The RV, usually a sanctuary, felt too small, too exposed. As darkness fell, the noises began again. Soft tapping on the windows, the faint crunch of gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, but the beam illuminated nothing but empty forest. Then I noticed them. handprints smeared faintly on the glass. My stomach turned. The prints were too large to be mine, and they hadn't been there earlier. The next morning, I debated leaving. I should have. But something about the man in the carvings tugged at me. Who was he? Why had he been watching me? Against my better judgment, I decided to hike back to Hozak's cave. This time in the early afternoon. The trail felt different. The woods were silent, no rustling leaves or bird calls, only the crunch of my boots. As I approached the cave, I heard it. Faint murmurs like voices carried on the wind. My name whispered so softly, I almost thought I imagined it. Nina. I froze. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from the cave, but from deeper in the forest. Against every instinct, I followed them. The trail dissolved into dense underbrush, branches clawing at my arms and legs. The voices were clearer now, overlapping and chaotic. Some sounded like my mother, others like my ex-boyfriend. I stumbled into a clearing and gasped. The hermit stood at the center, his back to me. Around him were crude wooden effigies tied with strips of cloth and hair. He turned slowly, his face hollowed and pale, his eyes dark pits. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a rasp. I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered, stepping back. "You're in it now," he said, taking a step closer. "The forest sees you. It doesn't let go." I turned and ran. I don't remember how I found my way back to the RV, only that my legs ached and my breath came in ragged gasps. I locked the doors and tried to calm myself, but the whispers followed, louder now. My name echoed from all directions. When night fell, I realized I wasn't safe. Shadows moved outside the windows and the tapping returned, rhythmic and deliberate. Then came the knocking, heavy and slow, rattling the RV. My camera sat on the table, its strap dangling over the edge. Desperate for proof, or maybe for distraction, I picked it up. I scrolled through the photos from the day and froze. In every shot, the hermit was there, hiding in the background behind trees, crouched near the cave, watching me. A loud thud jolted me from my seat. The door handle jiggled. My breath hitched. "Go away," I screamed. The handle stilled. A soft voice, barely audible, came from the other side. "Let me in." It wasn't the hermit's voice. It was mine. I didn't sleep that night, sitting with my back to the wall, clutching a kitchen knife. The knocking stopped after a while, but the whispers never did. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I started the RV and drove, not stopping until I reached the highway. But as I drove, the forest didn't seem to end. The road twisted endlessly through the same towering trees. My GPS flickered, the map refusing to load. It wasn't until I reached a rest stop that I allowed myself to breathe. The parking lot was empty, but it felt safer than the endless woods. I grabbed my camera, desperate to delete the photos, but as I scrolled, a new image appeared. It was me, sitting in the RV, staring at the camera. Behind me stood the hermit, his hollow eyes locked on mine. The last thing I remember is a tap on the window, followed by a whisper, "Nina." The screen went black, and so did everything else. My name is Richard Foster, and this happened to me on July 15th, 2010. I just picked up my new RV and was itching to take it out for a spin. I'd always been a bit of a loner, the kind of guy who enjoys his own company. So I decided to head out to the Oregon coast, somewhere remote and peaceful, away from the tourist traps. I parked the RV at a secluded spot in the Sazion National Forest, just a short walk from the beach. The place was beautiful, with tall pines and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. I was planning to spend a few days there fishing, reading, and just unwinding. The first day was perfect. I set up a little campfire, grilled some fish I caught, and enjoyed a couple of beers as the sun went down. The forest got eerily quiet, but I didn't mind. It was just me, the stars, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The next morning I woke up early, eager to explore the area. I hiked along the beach, finding little tide pools filled with crabs and starfish. I felt like I had the whole place to myself, which was exactly what I wanted. By the time I got back to the RV, it was late afternoon. I noticed something odd when I returned. There were footprints around my campsite. They weren't mine, and they definitely weren't from any animal I'd ever seen. They were large, too large to be human, and they had a strange, claw-like shape. I tried to shake it off, all thinking maybe it was just some weird trick of the sand. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustling in the trees, but whenever I turned my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination, the forest playing tricks on me. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I locked up the RV, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. I woke up a few hours later to a loud bang. It sounded like something had hit the side of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and a baseball bat I kept for protection and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim light around the campsite. I shone the flashlight around, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Just as I was about to go back inside, I heard it again, a loud thud from behind the RV. My heart was pounding in my chest as I walked around to the back, bat in hand. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a large, dark figure standing there, just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the flashlight beam. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I was frozen, unable to move or speak. Then, in a flash, it darted into the trees, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on where it had disappeared, and stumbled back into the RV. I locked the door and sat there, shaking, until morning. When the sun came up, I decided I'd had enough of this place. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and started to drive back home. As I was leaving, I noticed more of those strange footprints around the RV, like whatever it was had been circling it all night. On the drive back, I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone about it, figuring they'd think I was crazy, but I knew what I'd seen. That thing was real, and it was out there. A couple of weeks later, I was back at home, trying to put the experience behind me. One evening, I was watching the local news when a story caught my attention. A group of campers had gone missing in the same area where I'd been. The news anchor mentioned that their campsite was found abandoned, with signs of a struggle and strange footprints in the sand. My heart sank. I knew then that whatever I'd seen wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was dangerous. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd had a narrow escape. A few days later, I got a call from my friend Dave. He was a park ranger in the Sazian National Forest. I hadn't told him about my encounter, but he knew I'd been camping out there. He asked if I'd heard anything unusual while I was there. I hesitated, but decided to tell him everything. Dave listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're not the first one to see it, Richard. We've had reports of something like that for years, but we've never been able to find any solid evidence." He told me about the local legends, stories of a creature that the native tribes called Tenka. It was said to be a guardian of the forest, protecting it from intruders. Dave said that most of the reports were dismissed as folklore, but after what happened to the campers, he wasn't so sure anymore. I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me wanted to forget the whole thing, but another part of me couldn't let it go. I started reading up on local legends and cryptids, trying to find anything that matched what I'd seen. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Tashena was real. Months went by, and life returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, or hear a rustling in the bushes when there shouldn't be. I kept my doors locked and a gun by my bedside, just in case. One night, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I grabbed the gun and crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room window was shattered, and there was a large, dark shape moving around outside. I aimed the gun and shouted, "Get out of here!" The figure stopped, stood, and turned to look at me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then it let out a low, rumbling growl and disappeared into the night. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of it. They found the footprints, though, those same claw-like prints I had seen at the campsite. I moved away from Oregon not long after that. I couldn't live with the constant fear of Tenka reminding me again. I settled in a small town in Colorado, far away from the coast and the forests. I never told anyone there about what happened, but I stayed vigilant, always keeping an eye out for anything unusual. Years passed, and the memories of that summer started to fade. But every now and then, I'd hear about campers going missing in the Sazian National Forest, and I'd feel a chill run down my spine. I knew Tanka was still out there, watching and waiting. One evening, I got a call from Dave. He sounded shaken, more serious than I'd ever heard him. He told me that another group of campers had gone missing, and this time they'd found something. He wouldn't say what over the phone, but he asked if I could come back to Oregon. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I agreed, and a few days later, I was back in the Sazian National Forest, standing by a familiar stretch of beach. Dave led me to the campsite where the campers had disappeared. The place was a mess, with torn tents and scattered belongings. But it was what he showed me next that made my blood run cold. There, in the sand, was a piece of wood with strange markings on it. Dave said it looked like some kind of totem, something the local tribes used in their rituals. He believed it was a warning, a sign to stay away. I didn't need any more convincing. I left Oregon that day and never looked back. I sold the RV and bought a small cabin in the mountains, far away from any forests or beaches. I still think about Tashana sometimes, wondering if it's still out there, watching and waiting for its next victim. I don't know what it is or where it came from, but I do know one thing: I'll never go camping again. The forest isn't as peaceful as it seems, and some things are better left undisturbed. The smell of pine and the distant rustle of leaves woke me with an unsettling calm, like the forest itself was holding its breath. RV camping had always been my escape, a chance to step away from the grind of daily life and lose myself in the simplicity of nature. My name's Radford Kemp, and though life hadn't always been kind, I found peace in the solitude of the outdoors. This trip was supposed to be no different, just a weekend of solitude and fishing by a secluded lake in the heart of northern Montana. The spot I chose was far from main roads, deep in the woods where the trees stood like silent sentinels. I parked my RV at the edge of a small clearing, its dense canopy creating a cocoon of isolation. The nearby lake shimmered like a hidden gem, untouched and serene. It felt perfect, a little too perfect. I spent the morning setting up camp and then wandered to the lakeside with my fishing gear. Mist clung to the water, giving everything an ethereal glow. The chirping of birds and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore formed a soothing melody, pulling me into a tranquil rhythm. But by mid-afternoon, the mood shifted. The birds fell silent. An oppressive stillness swallowed the forest. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But then, I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a man stumbling from the shadows. His clothes were shredded and smeared with what looked like dried blood. His face was pale, his eyes wild. "Hey, are you all right?" I called, my voice unnaturally loud in the silence. He staggered closer, eyes locking onto mine. "Help me," he rasped before collapsing to the ground. Heart hammering, I ran to him. Up close, he looked worse. Cuts and bruises covered his face, and his hands were raw and trembling. "Who did this to you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the dread curling in my stomach. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice breaking with fear. "You have to leave. Now." I glanced toward the tree line, expecting something to emerge, but the woods remained still, unnervingly so. Helping the man to his feet, I half carried him to the RV and locked the door behind us. He drifted in and out of consciousness as I did my best to clean his wounds. My plan was to get him to a hospital in the morning. I didn't dare drive these treacherous forest roads at night. But as darkness fell, the forest changed. The comforting rustle of leaves turned into a sinister symphony of creaks and groans. Shadows stretched and twisted, and the stillness became suffocating. Around midnight, I heard it, the crunch of footsteps outside the RV. Slow, deliberate. I froze, every nerve on edge. Grabbing a flashlight and the largest kitchen knife I had, I crept toward the window. The steps circled the RV, steady and unhurried. My breath caught as a loud thud struck the side of the vehicle, followed by another and another, each impact rattling the walls. "Get away from here," I shouted, banging the knife handle against the door. My voice trembled as the pounding stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Minutes dragged into eternity. I didn't move, my knuckles white around the knife. Eventually, the footsteps retreated into the woods. I didn't sleep. Every rustle, every creak sent fresh waves of terror through me. At dawn, I decided it was time to leave. The man was still unconscious, but his breathing was steady. As I stepped outside to prepare the RV, my stomach dropped. Scratched into the paint of the RV's side were 3 chilling words: "You can't hide." The drive to town felt endless, every shadow in the mirror twisting into something menacing. At the hospital, they rushed the man into treatment while I slumped in the waiting room, exhausted and rattled. Hours later, a doctor informed me he was stable, but the police needed to talk to me. When the detectives arrived, I recounted everything, my voice trembling as I described the man's warning and the strange footsteps. They listened intently and assured me they'd investigate. A few days later, Detective Mendez called. Her tone was grim. "Mr. Kemp, we've uncovered something disturbing. The man you helped, his name is Jareth Drummond. He was reported missing 2 weeks ago, along with several others in that area. We found evidence near your campsite, signs of a struggle, blood, and traces suggesting there's a group operating in those woods." "What kind of group?" I whispered, the room spinning around me. "We're still investigating, but they target campers. Isolated ones. We believe they're responsible for multiple disappearances." Her words landed like a punch, each one heavier than the last. The scratches on my RV weren't just a threat, they were a promise. Months passed, and though life returned to normal, the memories lingered like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. I stopped camping in isolated areas, sticking to crowded, well-lit sites, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, another call from Detective Mendez brought closure and horror in equal measure. "We've arrested 2 suspects connected to the disappearances. They were part of a larger group involved in unspeakable acts. Unfortunately, we also discovered a hidden camp in the woods. Among the remains, we found the bodies of Jareth Drummond's companions. They didn't make it." A cold numbness settled over me. I had escaped by sheer luck, but so many others hadn't. That night, as I sat by a fire in my backyard, the flames flickered against the darkness. The stars above twinkled, indifferent to the horrors below. The forest, once my sanctuary, had revealed its true face, a place where the line between life and death could vanish in an instant. There's something deeply unsettling about the smell of pine trees and campfire smoke in the early morning. It's not a warm, nostalgic scent, but one that clings too tightly, too sharp, like it's trying to warn you. I should have known then that this weekend would be different. My name's Jebby Dude, and for years I've taken solo RV trips into the forests of Maine to clear my head. These trips have always been my sanctuary, but this one shattered all of that. The day started innocently enough. I woke to the crisp air, the remnants of last night's ash mingling with the freshness of morning dew. After a lazy stretch, I decided to jog a bit, clear my head before venturing deeper into the woods. I'm no survivalist, but I know my way around nature. I had my compass, a solid sense of direction, and just enough confidence to get myself into trouble. The forest was alive at first. Birds chirped, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the occasional deer startled me from the corner of my eye. About an hour into my hike, though, I stumbled upon a faint trail. It was less a path and more a scar cutting through the wilderness, overgrown and forgotten. Something about it called to me, a morbid curiosity that I should have ignored. The further I went, the quieter it became. The cheerful sounds of the forest faded into an oppressive silence, thick and unnatural. My steps felt intrusive, each crunch of leaves and snap of twigs a violation of something sacred. And then I saw it. The first sign that I wasn't alone. An old truck sat among the trees, its metal skin rusted and warped, nearly consumed by vines. Nearby, a cabin loomed, sagging under the weight of decades. Its windows were clouded with grime, its walls scarred by time. My breath hitched as I stared at it. Something about the cabin felt wrong, but I couldn't help myself. Against my better judgment, I approached. The interior was exactly what you'd expect from a place like that: dust, rot, and the musty smell of decay. A table, half collapsed under the weight of neglect, stood in the center. Shelves lined the walls, their contents long since pillaged or broken. I was about to leave when I noticed it. A single footprint pressed into the dust. It was fresh. Too fresh. My skin prickled, and a low hum of fear settled in my chest. I turned to leave, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. That's when I heard it. A shuffle, faint but deliberate, from somewhere inside the cabin. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. A raccoon, a gust of wind, and then the door creaked open. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound firm. A man stepped into the doorway. His disheveled figure was illuminated by the dim light filtering through the trees. He looked like he hadn't slept or bathed in weeks. Wild hair framed a gaunt face, his eyes sunken and brimming with desperation. In his hand, he clutched a knife. The blade was rusted, its edge jagged, but his grip was tight. Too tight. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low and ragged. "Easy, man," I replied, raising my hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't know anyone lived here. Just camping, that's all." His eyes darted around, suspicious and erratic. He took a step toward me, and I saw something flicker in his gaze, a mixture of fear and madness. My stomach dropped. He wasn't going to let me leave. I took a cautious step back, my heel catching on a root. I stumbled, and in that split second, he lunged. The knife glinted as it came toward me. Instinct took over. I threw myself to the side, barely dodging the blade. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed the nearest weapon, a heavy branch, and swung with everything I had. The wood connected with his arm, and he howled, dropping the knife. I didn't wait for him to recover. I shoved him to the ground and ran, adrenaline driving me faster than I'd ever thought possible. I didn't stop until I was back at my RV, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My chest heaved, my lungs burning as I tried to process what had just happened. Who was he, and why was he out there? I didn't stick around to find out. Fumbling with my keys, I started the RV and tore down the dirt road, the forest closing in on either side. The peace I'd come here for was now a twisted memory. Hours later, I sat in a diner in the nearest town, my hands still trembling around a mug of coffee. A flyer on the bulletin board caught my eye. 3 faces stared back at me from missing persons notices. All of them had disappeared within the last year. All of them near the area I'd just fled. The man's face burned in my memory. Was he responsible? The thought made my skin crawl, but I wasn't about to stick around and play detective. I reported everything to the local sheriff. He listened, his expression grim. "We've had reports of a squatter," he said, "but no one's ever gotten close enough to see him." They promised to investigate, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That man wasn't just squatting, he was hunting. Weeks passed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But some nights I'd sit on my porch, staring into the darkness, wondering if he'd followed me. The thought was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. The world isn't as safe as we like to think. Sometimes it's not the wild animals or the terrain you need to fear. It's the people. It began like any other camping trip. I was nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, my RV parked in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering pines. This trip was supposed to be my solace, a chance to clear my head and find some semblance of peace after a rough divorce. My name is Warren Grady, and I've faced my share of storms, but I thought this trip might offer a break from the turbulence. How wrong I was. The day started beautifully. Crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I sipped a cold beer by a crackling fire. By dusk, the shadows grew long and the forest quieted into an eerie stillness. That's when I noticed it. A faint trail leading into the woods, nearly hidden beneath the undergrowth. Curiosity got the better of me. Flashlight in hand, I followed the path. After 20 minutes, the trail opened into a small clearing. At its center stood an old, dilapidated cabin. The structure seemed to sag under the weight of time. Broken windows, rotting wood, and a door barely clinging to its hinges. It felt wrong, as if the forest itself recoiled from its presence. My gut told me to leave it alone, and I did, at least for the moment. Back at camp, I tried to shake the unease. A hearty meal and a few more beers later, I crawled into bed. But my sleep was short-lived. I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the RV. At first, I thought it might be an animal. But then came the whispers, soft, barely audible, yet undeniably human. My chest tightened. Gripping a hunting knife and flashlight, I peeked out the window, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Only the fire's dying embers cast flickering shadows. I convinced myself it was my imagination and forced myself back to bed, though my nerves remained frayed. Morning brought sunlight and the illusion of safety. Determined to enjoy the day, I grabbed my fishing gear and followed the trail again. Passing the cabin, I felt the same oppressive dread, its empty windows staring like hollow eyes. I hurried past it and eventually found a serene stream where I spent hours fishing in blessed solitude. But on my return, my heart dropped. The cabin's door, which had hung ajar the previous day, was now closed. My breath hitched. Someone had been there. Against my better judgment, I approached, knife in hand, and pushed the door open. It groaned loudly, revealing a dark and decayed interior. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the air reeked of mildew and rot. I found nothing inside, except a small metal locket lying in the dust. Opening it revealed a faded photograph of a woman and a child. I pocketed it, planning to turn it over to the authorities. As I left, I felt the cabin's presence pressing against my back, as if it were watching. That night, the whispers returned. Louder, closer. The firelight danced wildly as I clutched my knife and flashlight, every muscle tensed. Then I heard it, a thud from the direction of the cabin. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I followed the sound into the woods, my flashlight carving feeble paths through the darkness. The cabin loomed ahead, its door wide open now, as if inviting me. Inside, the whispers surrounded me, rising like a chorus of agony. They led me to a trapdoor half hidden beneath debris. My pulse thundered in my ears as I pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into blackness. Each step down felt heavier, the air colder and thicker. At the bottom was a dirt-floored cellar. A massive wooden crate sat in the center, its presence malevolent. The whispers ceased as I approached, replaced by an oppressive silence. With trembling hands, I pried the crate open. Inside were bones, twisted, broken, human remains piled in grotesque disarray. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. Before I could react further, footsteps echoed behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating a figure, a man, gaunt and wild-eyed, his face twisted with a feral madness. He lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. We grappled, rolling across the cold dirt. His strength was monstrous. I slashed wildly with my knife, catching his arm, but he didn't stop. His hands closed around my throat, choking the life from me. In a desperate surge, I managed to kick him off. He stumbled, striking his head against the crate's edge. He collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. I staggered to my feet, gasping for air, and fled the cellar. The whispers rose behind me, angry now, as if I'd disturbed something that should have been left alone. I reached the RV in a frenzy, my shaking hands struggling to start the engine. The cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror as I sped away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, even miles away. At the nearest town, I went straight to the sheriff. Deputies investigated and confirmed the horrors I'd uncovered. The bones belonged to multiple victims, hikers and campers who had vanished over the past decade. The man I had fought was a drifter, a serial killer using the cabin as his slaughterhouse. And the whispers, they were real. The deputies, hardened men, admitted to hearing them, pleading, mournful voices of the forgotten dead. I never returned to those woods, but the cabin haunts my dreams. Its whispers still echo in my mind, a reminder that the wilderness holds secrets darker than I'd ever imagined. I should have turned around the moment I saw it. The RV was a rusting relic in the middle of the New Mexico desert, tilted awkwardly like a monument to some long-forgotten tragedy. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows over the arid plains. My name is Dwayne, and I'm no stranger to solitude. As an experienced camper, I've always sought out the untouched corners of nature, the kind of places where silence is your only company. But this time, my quest for peace had brought me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to be. The dirt road that had led me here was more like a scar on the land, narrow and treacherous. After hours of bone-jarring driving, I finally found what seemed like the perfect spot. Flat ground, an endless view of the horizon, and not a single sign of life for miles. I parked my RV, stepped out into the dry, warm air, and tried to shake off the nagging sense of unease. That's when I noticed the other RV. It was at least 50 yards away, battered and coated in layers of dust. Even from a distance, it looked wrong. Too still, too forgotten. Something about it gnawed at me, but curiosity won out. I told myself I'd just take a quick look. Maybe someone needed help. Maybe it was abandoned. Either way, I couldn't leave it unexplored. As I approached, the details sharpened. The windows were smeared with grime, one of the tires was shredded to ribbons, and the entire vehicle reeked of neglect. I knocked on the door, half hoping no one would answer. Silence. The door creaked open under my touch, and I peered inside. The stench hit me first, a sickly mix of mildew and decay. The interior was a chaos of scattered belongings, old camping gear, rusted cans, and clothing that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. Half buried beneath a pile of torn clothes was a journal, its leather cover cracked and faded. It belonged to someone named Earl. The entries were uneven, scrawled in a hand that grew shakier as the pages went on. He'd been out here a year ago, searching for a rumored abandoned mine that supposedly held something valuable, but the later entries hinted at something darker. Earl wrote about strange noises echoing in the night, about shadows that didn't belong to anything he could see. His final entry ended abruptly, the words trailing off like the last desperate breath of a man teetering on the edge of madness. I shut the journal and shoved it into my pocket, a chill running down my spine. This wasn't what I'd come here for. I left the RV and returned to my campsite, determined to put the whole thing out of my mind. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, I built a fire and settled in with a beer. The stars began to creep out, blanketing the sky in a way that should have been calming. But Earl's journal lingered in my thoughts. What had he found? Or worse, what had found him? I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly, my pulse hammering in my ears. Thump, 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 thump. The sound was faint but insistent, cutting through the silence like a knife. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness. The noise was coming from the other RV. Heart pounding, I approached, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. A dim glow seeped through the RV's filthy window. I climbed up, peered inside, and froze. A man was crouched on the floor, hammering at something with feverish intensity. His movements were jerky, frantic, like a puppet on frayed strings. I knocked on the window, and his head snapped up. His eyes met mine, wide, bloodshot, and brimming with a madness that made my stomach lurch. The door flew open before I could react. The man lunged at me, wielding a metal pipe. "Stay away," he screamed, his voice raw and ragged. I stumbled backward, narrowly dodging the first swing. The second nearly caught my shoulder, but I managed to wrestle the pipe from his grip. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, pinning him to the ground. His chest heaved as he glared up at me, his wild eyes darting everywhere. "Jake," he finally spat. "I was with Earl." "What happened to him?" Jake's face crumpled and he let out a shuddering breath. He lost it. Heard things, saw things. He went after me one night. I didn't have a choice. His voice dropped to a whisper. I had to kill him. The air seemed to thicken around me. I let him up, keeping my distance as he led me to the back of the RV. There, under a pile of hastily arranged rocks, was Earl. A crude knife protruded from his chest. My stomach churned, but I couldn't look away. "We need to go to the police," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Jake shook his head violently. "No, they won't believe me. They'll think I'm lying." Before I could argue, a loud crash shattered the night. It came from the direction of the mine. Jake's face turned pale. "They're coming," he whispered. "Who?" I demanded, but he just shook his head. I grabbed my rifle and followed him into the desert. As we approached the mine, the whispers began. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Low voices, twisted laughter. The entrance yawned before us, a black maw in the earth. Inside, men were digging frantically, their faces gaunt and feral. Jake froze. "They killed Earl," he hissed. Before I could react, one of them spotted us. His eyes gleamed as he raised a shovel. "Looks like we've got company." Chaos erupted. I fought off one attacker, while Jake struggled with two more. The world narrowed to a blur of shadows and violence, until a gunshot cracked the air. One of the men fell, and the others scattered into the night. Jake stood trembling, the rifle slipping from his hands. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, collapsing to his knees. We didn't wait to see if the others would return. We grabbed what we could from the mine, maps, journals, tools, and fled. By dawn, we were at the nearest police station, turning over everything. Jake's fate was out of my hands, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the desert hadn't finished with us. Some things should stay buried. It started as a simple getaway, a desperate escape to Bryce Canyon, a break from the grind and a chance to reconnect with the raw, untamed pulse of nature. The previous months had been a blur of deadlines, stress mounting like a vice around my chest. I needed this trip, a fleeting moment of solitude. Just me and my RV. A rented slice of freedom against the vast, untouched beauty of Utah's rugged landscapes. My name's Vincent. I'm not the adventurous type, more of an overworked guy seeking peace. So, when I arrived early that morning, the sun casting long, eerie shadows over the red rock formations, it felt like a different world. The canyons stood like ancient, silent sentinels, guarding secrets older than time itself. I parked my RV in a secluded area, away from the crowds. Solitude, true, quiet solitude, was what I craved. After setting up camp, I decided to take a hike. A trail not far from my spot beckoned, winding deeper into the canyon with promises of stunning views and solitude. I laced up my boots, filled my water bottle, and set off. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of gravel underfoot. The trail led me through narrow, twisting passages, opening up onto cliffs that looked out over the deep, barren canyon below. I paused often, not just to catch my breath, but to drink in the haunting beauty, to let it seep into my bones. There was something surreal about this place. The worries of the world seemed to evaporate with every step. The air grew hotter as the sun climbed higher, and I found shelter beneath a rock overhang. There, I ate slowly, savoring the sandwich I pulled from my pack. The stillness was perfect, a quiet that sank into my skin like a soothing balm. It was then that I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought nothing of them. Bryce Canyon is popular with hikers, after all. But these were fresh, and they led off the trail into a part of the canyon that seemed inaccessible. Dangerous. Curiosity gnawed at me. I followed. The trail grew steeper, rougher, winding through jagged boulders and narrowing gaps in the rock. The temperature dropped as I descended into a hidden ravine. The walls towered on either side, casting dark shadows that felt oppressive. My footsteps echoed, unsettling in the stillness. I moved slowly, unease gnawing at my gut. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't put my finger on. That's when I saw it. A torn piece of fabric caught on a thorny bush. It looked like part of a shirt, faded and stained. My heart began to hammer in my chest. There was something deeply wrong about this. I pressed on, the footprints now accompanied by scuff marks, broken branches, signs of a struggle. I stumbled upon the camp next. It was makeshift, a tattered tarp strung between two rocks, a fire pit with still warm ashes. Personal items were scattered around, clothes, a backpack, a few empty cans, but no people. I called out, my voice thin and strained, but it was swallowed by the canyon. Silence. That's when I saw the blood. A dark, pooled stain on the ground, partially covered by rocks. More blood smeared across the tarp. A chill crawled down my spine. Someone had been hurt, or worse. I had no cell service here, no way to call for help. Panic clawed at my throat, but something pushed me forward. The need to know, to find out what had happened, overpowered my fear. I followed the blood. It led deeper into the ravine. The walls closed in, and the air grew thick, heavy with dread. I rounded a bend, and that's when I saw him. A body. A man. His clothes were torn, his skin bloodied and pale. His face a mask of pain, of terror, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. I'd never seen anything like it. Not like this. He'd been stabbed brutally, over and over. The wounds were vicious, furious. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I spun around, panic flooding my veins. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. He held a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. My legs froze. My heart thundered in my chest. "What are you doing here?" His voice was calm, almost casual, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "I got lost," I stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude." He stepped closer, the knife hanging low but ready. "You shouldn't have come here." My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I glanced around. Nothing. The walls of the ravine were too steep to climb. The only path out was blocked. "I don't want trouble," I whispered, my voice trembling. He laughed. A hollow, cruel sound. Too late for that. Before I could react, he lunged at me, the knife flashing in the air. I barely had time to dive aside, the blade grazing my ribs. Pain exploded in my side. I stumbled, barely catching myself. He came again, relentless. I scrambled to grab a rock, throwing it at him with all the force I could muster. It struck his shoulder, but it didn't slow him down. I was unarmed, desperate. Then I saw it. A narrow gap between the rocks. It was my only chance. I darted for it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of his footsteps growing closer. The knife swished past me, a blur of steel. I squeezed through the gap, the rough rocks scraping my skin, my clothes tearing, but I didn't care. I could hear him behind me, cursing, the knife clanging against the stone. I emerged on the other side, a ledge overlooking a sheer drop. There was nowhere to go. I turned my back to the wall. He was stuck in the gap, struggling to get through. I could see the rage in his eyes, the need to kill. In a burst of clarity, I knew what I had to do. I picked up a rock, heavy and jagged, and waited. As he neared, I swung with everything I had. The rock crashed into his head, and he cried out, collapsing backward into the gap. I didn't wait to see if he was dead or just unconscious. I scrambled down the ledge, slipping, falling, but desperate to escape. I stumbled back to the trail, my body shaking, my mind a fog of fear and adrenaline. I reached my RV and locked the door behind me. My hands shook violently as I dialed 911, my voice a hoarse whisper. The operator promised help was on the way. I sat there, staring out the window, my mind replaying every moment, the man's face, the blood, the body in the ravine. It all felt unreal, like a nightmare. But the pain in my side, the blood on my shirt, it was too real. The sirens grew louder. Relief washed over me, but so did a deep, gnawing exhaustion. I closed my eyes and leaned back, waiting for the nightmare to end. When the police arrived, I led them back to the ravine. They found the body just as I described. The man was still alive, barely, unconscious, but alive. They took him into custody. His face was grim as they hauled him away. Later back at the station, I learned the truth. The man wasn't just some loner. He was a fugitive, a killer, wanted for a string of brutal murders across several states. He had been hiding out in the canyon, using it as his hunting ground. I was just the latest in a long line of victims, the one who'd gotten away. The days that followed blurred into one long waking nightmare. Interviews, paperwork, medical exams. They stitched up the cut on my side, gave me painkillers, and told me to rest. But rest was the last thing on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about how close I had come to dying the night. I had come to the rundown RV campground tucked away off a forgotten road in rural Pennsylvania for some peace, some escape from the weight of the last few months. The place was nothing more than a cluster of old, weathered spots with hookups, a rotting building that served as both an office and a general store, and nothing else but forest. It wasn't peak season, which meant I'd have the quiet I craved. I parked my RV, set everything up, and quickly noticed the few other campers around. An old man, his face hidden under the brim of a faded baseball cap, sat a few spots down. A young couple, seemingly in the middle of an argument, struggled to set up their tent. I didn't care. People had their problems, and I had mine. I wasn't here to make friends. By late afternoon, I'd unpacked and decided to stretch my legs with a walk around the area. The campground bordered dense woods, and a faint trail beckoned me. A little hike would help clear my mind, I thought, so I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The woods were unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. At first, I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the place, but the silence gnawed at me. I pressed on, following the trail, barely visible under thick layers of fallen leaves and overgrown brush. An hour later, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the middle of it sat the remains of a shack, its roof caved in, walls rotting, the timbers crumbling beneath years of neglect. I couldn't resist the temptation. I ventured closer, hoping for something interesting to photograph. Inside, I found old, rusted tools and shattered furniture, clear signs that no one had been here in ages. I snapped a few pictures, imagining how they might look on social media. As I made my way back, something felt off. The path I had taken seemed different. The trees, the brush, the way the leaves were scattered, it didn't look like the same trail. My pulse quickened as I realized I was lost. I retraced my steps, trying to find something familiar, but the woods seemed to twist around me, warping and shifting. My heart raced. After what felt like hours, I stumbled back to the campground, my legs aching. I was relieved to find my RV where I had left it, but as I stepped up to the door, my stomach dropped. It was ajar. I stepped inside cautiously. My worst fear was realized. My things had been rifled through. Clothes thrown about, drawers pulled open. Someone had been inside. The young couple? The old man? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I went first to the old man's RV. He was sitting outside, carving a piece of wood with a dull knife. His eyes didn't meet mine when I asked if he had seen anyone near my RV. He shrugged without a word. There was something cold in his gaze, an unsettling distance. Next, I approached the young couple, still sitting by a fire. They looked tense, perhaps still arguing, but when I told them what had happened, they feigned surprise, denying they'd seen anything. I didn't trust them, but what could I do? Frustrated and shaken, I returned to my RV. I locked the door, checked the windows, and decided to call it a night. But as I lay in bed, the feeling that I was being watched grew unbearable. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but as the night deepened, my anxiety grew. Around midnight, the knocking came, loud, relentless. My heart skipped a beat as I grabbed a flashlight, creeping to the door. "Who's there?" I called. No answer. The knocking continued, growing more insistent. My hands trembled as I opened the door, shining the flashlight out into the darkness. No one. The silence was suffocating, and my nerves were frayed. I stepped outside, scanning the empty campground. That's when I saw it. The old man's RV door was wide open, and the lights were off. I approached, my stomach churning with dread. The smell hit me first, a sickening, metallic stench that made me gag. I pushed the door open and froze. There on the floor lay the old man, his throat slashed open. Blood pooled around him, staining the ground dark crimson. My legs turned to jelly, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I bolted back to my RV, locking the door behind me, but as I grabbed my phone to call the police, I found there was no signal. Of course, I cursed the isolation of the place. The thought of driving out in the dark crossed my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I grabbed a kitchen knife instead, huddling in the corner, waiting for the morning. The night stretched on, filled with every creak and groan of the RV. Each noise made my heart leap into my throat. I kept replaying the image of the old man's lifeless eyes in my mind, haunted by the brutal scene I had just witnessed. At first light, I made my way to the campground office, praying to find help. But when I arrived, the door was unlocked. Inside, the place was a mess, papers scattered, shelves overturned. The office had been ransacked. Despair crept in as I found an old, dusty phone. But when I picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. Defeated, I walked back to my RV, only to find the young couple's tent had vanished. Gone. They had disappeared. A sickening thought crossed my mind. What if they were the killers? Or worse, had they met the same fate as the old man? I rushed back to my RV, only to find a note stuck to the door with a hunting knife. "You're next." My blood ran cold. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to start the engine, peeling out of the campground, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be chasing me. Hours later, I found a small town and stumbled into the police station, breathless, eyes wide with terror. I told them everything. They confirmed my story. The old man was dead, but the young couple was still missing. They assured me they would investigate. I stayed in town for a few days, my nerves on edge, constantly feeling like someone was watching me. Then came the call from the police. They had reviewed security footage from the campground. In the grainy video, the young couple was seen leaving, looking nervous, glancing over their shoulders as they packed their car. Then the footage shifted to the office, showing a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, muscular, wearing a hoodie and gloves, moving with cold precision. The killer. The police assured me they were working on identifying him. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, but inside, fear and anger roiled. I had become a target, but why? A week later, as I was walking back to my motel room, I felt something. Someone following me. I turned, heart pounding, but there was no one there. Just as I reached my door, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around, knife in hand, ready to strike. It was a deputy, his face pale, his eyes grim. "We need to talk," he said, leading me to his car. The killer had been watching us all along, studying us. The deputy explained they had discovered something at the campground, a hidden room in the old shack I had found. Inside, they had found maps, surveillance equipment, and photos of me, the old man, and the young couple. The killer hadn't been targeting random people. He had been after something, and we had all come too close to finding it. The old man had been hunting treasure. The killer had been hunting us. The deputy took me to a safe house, But the killer wasn't done yet. That night, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. I crept to the window, heart in my throat, knife in hand. But before I could make a move, the door burst open. The killer lunged at me. We struggled. The crash of furniture, the sound of breathless grunts. I was terrified, but I fought back with everything I had. I managed to drive my knife into his side, and he stumbled back with a growl of pain. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to keep moving. I didn't stop until I lost him, but I knew he wasn't done with me. I returned to the shack, the place where it all started, desperate for answers. Inside, among the maps and photos, I found a journal, the old man's. It detailed his search for hidden treasure buried deep within the woods. The killer had been eliminating anyone who got too close. I had to tell the police. As I left the shack, I heard footsteps again. The killer was back, angrier than ever. But this time, I was ready. We fought again, and I managed to knock him out, tying him up with old rope I found. I ran to the nearest house, pounded on the door until someone answered. The police arrived swiftly, and the killer was arrested. The young couple was found alive. The police responded quickly, apprehending the killer. The young couple, though found alive in a nearby town, was too frightened to come forward. The case was closed. Yet, as I departed the campground, the old man's vacant stare lingered in my mind. His eyes would haunt me for the rest of my life. My name is Jonas McKinn, and I'm about to tell you about the most horrifying day of my life. The day that shattered any notion I had of safety, of peace. It all began innocently enough, with what I thought would be a simple, relaxing RV camping trip. After months of grueling, soul-sucking work, I craved solitude, an escape from the relentless grind of life. The mountains of Colorado called to me, a perfect place to disconnect, recharge, and find some semblance of peace. I wasn't the type to carry a gun. I never saw the need. Besides, I wasn't there for hunting or survival. I wanted tranquility. The drive up to the campsite was breathtaking. Tall pines lined the narrow, winding road, their dark silhouettes stretching skyward against the crisp, clean air. My RV was far from luxurious, but it was a cozy refuge, equipped with the essentials and nothing more. I parked in a secluded spot, near a small clearing, the surrounding forest dense and almost unnervingly quiet. The nearest town was miles away. That was exactly what I wanted. The first half of the day was a dream. I set up camp, cooked a simple meal on my portable stove, and buried my nose in a book I'd been meaning to read for ages. Hours passed in blissful solitude. The forest seemed alive, but in the gentlest way. Birds singing, the wind rustling through the leaves, the soft crackle of dry twigs underfoot. I even took a nap in my hammock, strung up between two sturdy trees, rocked gently by the breeze. But as the afternoon wore on, an unsettling shift began. It started with a faint, strange smell. Smoke, but not from any nearby campfire. It was distant, almost faintly chemical, like something burning but wrong. I tried to dismiss it. After all, I was alone. Who else could it be? As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching across the forest floor in ways that felt wrong, as if they were waiting for something. The peaceful serenity I'd basked in turned into something more oppressive. A creeping unease started to gnaw at me. Then I heard it. A rustling, soft but deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a whisper. I froze. My heart picked up, beating harder against my chest. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, just some creature scurrying through the underbrush. But it came again, closer this time. A distinct shuffle, a breath of a presence. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling, and aimed the beam into the dark. The light barely cut through the thick undergrowth, offering only glimpses of shadow. Nothing moved. Just nerves, I muttered, forcing myself to relax. It's just the forest. But then came the sound that made my blood run cold. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. Someone or something was out there. And it wasn't an animal. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unsteady. "Is someone there?" Silence answered. Just the quiet, unnerving stillness of the woods. I packed up my gear quickly, leaving the fire to burn down into embers, a small, flickering beacon of light in the growing darkness. I locked the RV doors and shut the blinds, trying to turn the small space into a fortress. The air felt thick now, every tiny noise amplified in the silence. The hours dragged on, but no matter how I tried to settle, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. At midnight, the footsteps started. Slow, deliberate, circling the RV like a predator studying its prey. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were not trying to hide. They wanted me to know they were there. I grabbed the largest knife I had from the kitchen. It was pitifully small, a kitchen knife, but it was all I had. My grip tightened around its handle as I sat, listening. The footsteps stopped suddenly, but only for a moment. Then came the first bang. Loud, forceful, on the side of the RV. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. Another bang, this time on the other side. "Get the hell away from here," I yelled, trying to sound brave, but my voice cracked. Silence followed. I thought maybe they had gone, until the next round of banging came, even louder and more insistent. And then, a laugh. Low, mocking, bone-chilling. They were playing with me. I backed away from the door, the knife shaking in my grip. I could hear them now, scraping sounds, the unmistakable sound of something trying to pry open the door. My mind raced. I had to escape. I scanned the RV for any way out, and my eyes landed on the small bathroom window. It was a tight squeeze, but it was my only chance. I didn't think, I just acted. I managed to wriggle through the window and dropped into the cold earth outside, landing with a thud. Without a second thought, I ran, blindly into the woods, heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I could hear them. The relentless, thudding crash of footsteps growing closer, closer, closer. My breath came in ragged gasps, burning my lungs. The trees closed in around me, shadows whispering with every step I took. I stumbled, fell, my hands and knees scraping against the rough ground. My legs screamed in pain, but I forced myself to push forward. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. They were coming. Then, through the trees, I saw a small clearing. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest, and finally broke into the clearing, alone. For a moment, it was quiet, but I knew better than to believe it. I ducked behind a large fallen tree, my breaths shallow and quick, praying they wouldn't find me. The forest was dead silent, then a voice. Low, taunting. "You can't hide forever, Jonas." My blood turned to ice. They knew my name. I dared to peek over the log, and there they were, 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing. Dressed in dark, weathered clothes, their faces obscured by grotesque masks. One of them held a long hunting knife, the blade gleaming in the moonlight. I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to run again. I bolted, not looking back, feeling the wind rush past my face. The underbrush tore at my clothes, my skin, but I didn't stop. I had to make it to the road, had to find help. I could hear them chasing, gaining on me, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I pushed harder, my muscles burning, my leg throbbing with pain. And then I saw it, the glimmer of headlights in the distance. I ran toward it, waving my arms, screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a stunned expression, rolled down his window. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted. "They're trying to kill me." I gasped, yanking open the door. "Drive! Now!" He didn't need to be told twice. The car roared to life, speeding away from the forest, from the nightmare. I glanced back. There, standing at the edge of the road, was one of the figures, watching us leave. The man drove a few miles before pulling over to call the police. They arrived quickly, scouring the area. They found my RV, vandalized but intact, no sign of the 3 figures. They had vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but the lingering terror they had left in their wake. I was alive, but I was never the same. Every year, I looked forward to my RV camping trip, a solitary escape from the relentless demands of life. This year, however, I sought something different, something more remote. I ventured deep into the backwoods of Oregon, far from the hum of civilization. My name's Felix Reinhardt. I've had my share of failures. My business crumbled 5 years ago, and soon after, so did my marriage. But this trip, this escape into the wild, was my sanctuary. It was just me, nature, and the hum of my RV. The morning air was crisp, with the forest alive in a burst of early autumn color. I set up camp beside a secluded lake, the only sound the distant gurgle of a stream and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. After a quick breakfast, I decided to hike a nearby trail, a path that, according to local legend, led to an old abandoned cabin. I'd always been drawn to forgotten places, remnants of lives once lived, left to fade into memory. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, a map, and a flashlight and set off. The trail was little more than a suggestion, barely visible, swallowed by the forest floor. But the allure of adventure called to me, and I pushed on. Birds sang overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at small creatures scurrying away. After an hour of climbing steep terrain, the trees grew thicker, and the sunlight dimmed, casting an eerie twilight across the path. When the cabin finally appeared through the dense woods, it looked as though it had been swallowed by time itself. The structure leaned dangerously to one side, its windows shattered, its door hanging off its hinges. The air around it was unnervingly still, a thick silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Unease prickled at the back of my neck, but I brushed it aside. I had come for this, something to break the monotony. I pushed the door open, and it creaked, the sound shrill in the oppressive quiet. The inside was suffocatingly musty, filled with the smell of rot and decay. An old table sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by a few chairs, and a fireplace blackened with soot. I snapped a few photos, thinking they'd make great additions to my travel blog. But as I moved deeper into the cabin, something caught my eye. A trapdoor, half hidden beneath a threadbare rug. Curiosity gripped me, and I pulled the rug aside, lifting the trapdoor with a groan of protest from the wood. A cold, damp air rushed up from the cellar below, carrying a strange metallic tang that turned my stomach. It felt wrong, but I couldn't resist. I grabbed my flashlight and descended the wooden ladder into the darkness. The cellar was small, the stone walls damp and unwelcoming. Shelves lined one wall, filled with old, rusted tools and jars whose contents had long since evaporated. In the center of the room sat a large wooden crate, bound with heavy iron bands. It was too large to be anything ordinary, almost like a coffin. My pulse quickened. What could be inside? With a deep breath, I pried the lid open. Wrapped in a tattered cloth, I found a collection of old journals. Their pages were yellowed with age, and as I flipped through them, a chill ran down my spine. The entries detailed the life of the cabin's previous owner, his isolation in the woods, and his increasingly paranoid thoughts about someone or something watching him. A noise from above shattered the silence. It was a footstep, faint but distinct. I froze, listening. Another footstep, then another. Someone was in the cabin. My heart slammed into my chest. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the cellar into blackness, and held my breath, hoping I hadn't been heard. Footsteps creaked above, and the sound of rummaging. A man's voice muttered, though I couldn't make out the words. Then the footsteps stopped. I heard the unmistakable creak of the door opening, and then a deep, gravelly voice cut through the silence. "Well, look what we have here," the man said, his voice mocking, low. "Come on up. Don't be shy." I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't stay in the dark, cramped cellar. But if I went up, who knew what I would face? The thought of being trapped in that cabin sent ice through my veins. "All right, have it your way," the man called, his footsteps moving toward the trapdoor. I didn't have a choice. My body moved before I could think, scrambling up the ladder. My hand grasped the edge of the trapdoor, but before I could pull myself up, a rough hand grabbed my wrist and yanked me the rest of the way out. I tumbled to the floor, my breath knocked from my chest. The journals I'd taken from the crate scattered around me, their pages fluttering like trapped birds. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky but firm. The man was tall, his broad shoulders hunched beneath an unkempt beard and wild hair. His flannel shirt and jeans were ripped and filthy. He crouched low, his eyes gleaming with something primal. "Name's Travis," he growled, kicking the trapdoor shut with a violent thud. "This is my cabin. What the hell are you doing here?" "I didn't know anyone lived here," I stammered, struggling to sit up. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "No one lives here, not anymore, but it's still mine." I glanced around desperately, my mind searching for any way out. The door was behind him, my backpack at his feet. He followed my gaze, his lip curling into a sneer as he kicked my bag aside. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his hand sliding to the knife at his belt. The blade caught the dim light and I felt my stomach drop. My breath caught in my throat. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll leave. You can have your cabin back." He shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Too late for that. You've seen too much." Before I could react, Travis lunged at me, the knife flashing through the air. I barely managed to roll to the side, my heart thundering in my chest. My hand brushed against something cold and hard, the flashlight. I snatched it up, swinging it at him. It struck his wrist with a sickening crack. He yelled in pain, dropping the knife. Without thinking, I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door, grabbing my backpack as I ran. Travis roared in fury, chasing me into the woods. My heart raced as branches whipped at my face and arms. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, closer with each passing moment. I had to lose him. Ahead, a fallen tree lay across the path, its roots jutting out like a natural barricade. I veered toward it, leaping over it and diving into the shadows on the other side. I crouched low, my breath coming in ragged gasps, praying he wouldn't see me. The sound of his footsteps thundered past, and I waited in the dark, barely breathing until the noise faded. When it was safe, I crawled from my hiding place and made my way back to camp, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't stop until I reached the RV, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, desperate to leave. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a small town. I parked in a quiet lot and sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was Travis? Why was he so desperate to keep that cabin a secret? Then it hit me. The journals. They were still in the cellar and there was no way I could go back, but maybe someone else could. I pulled out my phone and quickly typed a message to the local authorities explaining everything. The cabin. Travis. The journals. It was the best I could do. I only hoped it would be enough. Felix Reinhardt, signing off. You know that feeling when the silence gets so loud it almost suffocates you? I was sitting in my RV, parked in a remote corner of Oregon by a quiet river, hoping for a few days of solitude. A chance to fish, unwind, and escape my life's chaos. After losing my job and dealing with a bitter divorce, I needed this. The idea was simple, just me, the river, and a few good books. The morning had begun like any other, with the sun piercing the dense fog, casting a ghostly, golden light over the forest. The world was still, except for the soft rustling of the trees and the distant sound of the river. My name is Owen Nash. I should have known better, but the solitude was meant to be healing. My campsite was perfect, remote, peaceful, with an untouched view of the water. I'd already caught a couple of trout, enough for dinner, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine. That's when I saw it, a beat-up truck rumbling up the narrow path toward my RV. It crept in, the engine coughing like it had a mind of its own. A man stepped out, a tall, thin figure, his face obscured by greasy black hair hanging in tangled strands. He wore a tattered flannel, the kind that looked like it hadn't seen a wash in years, and faded jeans. His eyes locked onto mine as I stood by the riverbank. "Hey," he called out, his voice rough, gravelly, like it had been dragged through dirt. I hesitated. Something about him felt wrong, but I didn't want to be rude. "Sure," I replied, trying to keep things light. "Nice day, isn't it?" "Sure is," he said, his gaze sweeping over the area. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mind if I camp here for a bit?" I shrugged. There was no one else around. "It's a free country," I said, despite the unease gnawing at the back of my mind. He introduced himself as Vic, and though his handshake was firm, something about his grip unsettled me. He set up his tent not far from mine. He seemed harmless enough, but there was something unpredictable about him. As the day stretched on, we exchanged small talk. He claimed to be a drifter, moving from place to place, looking for odd jobs. When evening came, I offered him dinner. We grilled the trout I'd caught, and he shared a flask of whiskey. Surprisingly, conversation flowed easily. He was a good listener, and after a while, I found myself talking about things I hadn't spoken about in years. My failed marriage, my lost job, my regrets. For a brief moment, I almost forgot about the gnawing unease that had settled in my stomach. But then something changed. "You ever do something you regret?" Vic's voice dropped, suddenly low, laced with a quiet intensity. The question hung in the air like smoke. I could feel the temperature around us shift. "Haven't we all?" I replied, trying to keep the tone casual, though my skin prickled with unease. He stared into the fire, his eyes darkening. "Yeah. But some things, Owen, some things you can't take back." A cold chill slithered down my spine. The fire crackled, but the sound felt distant now. The air felt thick. I could hardly breathe. "What do you mean?" I asked, unable to keep my voice from shaking. Vic didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly pulled a knife from his boot, the blade catching the firelight. His gaze remained fixed on the flames, but his body was rigid, like a snake preparing to strike. "There's something I need to do," he said, his voice a whisper, yet it sliced through the air. My heart hammered in my chest. "What are you talking about, Vic?" He finally turned to face me, his eyes empty, like he was no longer seeing me, but something far darker. "I've done bad things, Owen. Things I need to make right." I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Listen, man, I don't know what you're talking about, but maybe you should leave." Before I could finish, he lunged. The knife flashed in the firelight, aimed straight for my chest. I barely managed to sidestep, my feet slipping on the uneven ground as I stumbled backward over a log. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a heavy branch, using it as a makeshift weapon. "Stay back!" I shouted, brandishing it between us. Vic didn't stop. His eyes were wild like a cornered animal. "You don't understand, Owen. It has to happen." His words came out in a low growl. Desperation clawed at my throat. I swung the branch, knocking the knife from his hand. It landed with a dull thud in the dirt, but Vic was relentless. He tackled me to the ground, his hands strong, fueled by something I couldn't name. We grappled, rolling in the dirt, our bodies crashing against rocks and branches. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice breaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't answer. Instead, he laughed, a chilling, maniacal sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was the kind of laugh that didn't belong to a human being. I knew I couldn't hold him down forever. I summoned every ounce of strength I had left, and with a wild swing, I struck him in the temple, sending him crashing to the ground, unconscious. Gasping for breath, I stood, my legs shaking beneath me. I grabbed the knife, but the thought of using it made my stomach twist. I didn't want to kill him, but I couldn't just let him go. I tied him up with rope from my RV, my hands trembling as I called the police. When the authorities arrived, they took Vic into custody. They searched his truck and found what I'd feared, evidence of crimes that made my stomach churn. Stolen goods, weapons, and something far worse. Missing persons' IDs. As they drove him away, I stood in the clearing, my mind spinning. My peaceful retreat had turned into a nightmare. A twisted reminder that life doesn't always go according to plan. Sometimes you're thrust into situations you never saw coming, and it's in those moments you find out what you're truly made of. The next morning, I packed up in silence, my hands moving mechanically, my thoughts consumed by the night. I drove away, Vic's haunting words echoing in my mind. Some things you can't take back. That night by the river was supposed to be an escape. Instead, it became the place where I faced my darkest fears and walked away alive. But I knew one thing for sure. The peace I'd come for was gone, and it may never return. It's strange how a day can begin with such simplicity, and by nightfall, everything you thought you knew about the world turns upside down. One minute, you're sipping your morning coffee, breathing in the fresh mountain air, and the next, you're fighting for your life. I've always loved RV camping. It's my escape from the city, a break from the constant hum of traffic and noise, a moment to just breathe. This time, I parked in a secluded spot deep in the Adirondack Mountains, a place I know well with a clear view of the serene lake and the thick, watchful forest. The world here felt far away, like nothing could touch me. My name's Melvin Everett. Life's thrown some heavy punches my way. Lost my parents young, scraped my way through life. You know the drill. But I made it, and these camping trips, they're my reward, my refuge, my time to reset. I woke up that morning to a peaceful silence. No birds singing, no sounds of cars, just the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees. The kind of peace that makes you think nothing could ever go wrong. I spent the day hiking, fishing in the lake, chatting with an older couple I met, the O'Briens, who were also RVing nearby. Everything felt normal. Good, even. But that tranquility didn't last. It was like the forest itself was warning me, though I didn't realize it at first. I heard it first, distant like thunder or the crack of a branch breaking. At first, I thought it was a gunshot. Hunters, maybe, though hunting season was still weeks away. Then another shot, closer this time. And then Another. My stomach tightened. Something wasn't right. I tried to push it out of my mind as I cleaned the trout I caught, but that's when I saw him, a man, stumbling out of the trees, blood soaking his torn clothes. He collapsed right near my RV, his face pale and twisted in terror. I rushed to him, dropping my fish to the ground. "Help me," he gasped, eyes wide, desperate. "They're after me." His breath was ragged, his voice trembling with fear. The smell of blood was thick in the air as I dragged him into the RV, trying to stop the bleeding. He could barely hold himself together, slipping in and out of consciousness. "Who's after you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, but he only muttered incoherently, shaking his head. It wasn't until I managed to patch up his wounds a bit that I heard them. Voices. Low, angry, searching. They were outside. I peeked through the window. 3 men, armed and shouting, combing through the area. My blood ran cold. "We know he's here. Find him," one of them snarled. The man in the RV was their target. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let them take him, not knowing what they'd do to him or what they were after. But calling the cops wasn't an option. There was no signal up here. I had to think fast. I shoved the man into a small storage compartment under the floor, cramped and suffocating, but it was the best I could do on short notice. As I finished, I heard their footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. "What do you want?" I called out, trying to keep my voice casual, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "We're looking for someone," the leader said, stepping forward. Tall, menacing, with a bandana covering most of his face. "Seen anyone?" I forced a smile. "Nope, haven't seen anyone all day." The leader didn't seem convinced, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "Mind if we take a look around?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Be my guest." They tore through my RV, tossing things aside, going through every drawer and container, my fists clenched. I had to keep them away from the compartment. It felt like hours, but eventually they gave up. "He's not here?" one of them muttered. "Keep looking," the leader spat, and they left. But I knew they wouldn't stop. They'd be back. I waited until the coast was clear, then pulled the man from the hiding spot. He was barely conscious, his lips moving, muttering something about evidence about exposing them. "What's your name?" I asked, but he barely managed to speak. Jake Myers," he whispered. I didn't have much time. I loaded Jake into the RV, securing him as best I could. We needed to get to town. Fast. As we drove, Jake explained what had happened. He had stumbled onto a drug deal gone wrong. These men were part of a larger operation, and Jake had evidence they were willing to kill for. Just when I thought we might get away, I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. Too close, too fast. They'd found us. I slammed my foot on the gas. The RV lurched forward, but it was no match for the SUV that was quickly gaining on us. Gunshots rang out, shattering the back window. I swerved, trying to shake them off, but they were relentless. "Jake, where's the evidence?" I yelled, my voice cracking. "In my backpack?" "Hidden compartment," he gasped. I reached back, my hands trembling, and found the USB drive. That was the prize, the reason they'd kill to get him. We needed a plan. Fast. I spotted an overgrown trail just off the road. It was a risk, but it was our only chance. I yanked the wheel and veered onto the narrow path. The RV bounced, branches scraping against the sides, but the thick trees might give us some cover. I told Jake to stay down and stay quiet as we drove deeper into the woods, the sound of the pursuing vehicle gradually fading. We stopped in a small clearing, the engine shutting off. I listened. No sign of them yet. "Stay here," I said, grabbing a flashlight and a wrench. I wasn't sure what I'd do with them, but it was all I had. I crept toward the main road. The men were out of their SUV, searching the area. Their voices were angry, frustrated. They were getting closer. I had an idea. If I could disable their vehicle, maybe we'd have a chance. I waited until they were deeper in the woods, then I made my move. I smashed the flashlight against their SUV's headlights, plunging the area into darkness, then slashed their tires with the wrench. I could only hope it would buy us enough time. I made it back to the RV, barely breathing, and drove off into the night. The tension was unbearable. Jake was in bad shape, but he insisted we were almost there, that he'd be okay. As dawn broke, I finally saw the lights of civilization ahead, the town. We made it to the police station, where the officers took Jake immediately. I handed them the USB drive and explained everything. They assured me they'd protect Jake and use the evidence to bring down the drug ring. As I watched them wheel him away, he weakly gripped my hand. "Thank you," he whispered before disappearing through the hospital doors. I stood there for a moment, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. It was over. At least my part in it was. I got back into my RV and drove away, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the town. As I drove, I couldn't help reflect on how quickly things can change. One moment, you're in the middle of nature's peace. The next, you're fighting for your life. Life can turn on a dime like that. And sometimes it's the unexpected turns that remind you of what really matters. I left it all behind, unsure of what lay ahead, but ready for whatever came next. The sun was merciless in the clear afternoon sky as I pulled my RV into a secluded spot in Joshua Tree National Park. After a brutal week at work, I craved isolation, time to breathe in the dry desert air and lose myself in the jagged silhouettes of ancient rock formations. The desert stretched endlessly before me, serene and hauntingly beautiful. I parked near a gnarled cluster of Joshua trees, their twisted shapes almost human in the harsh light. Setting up camp, I felt the weight of the city lift. By the time I settled into my lawn chair, cold beer in hand, the desert had worked its spell. The occasional dart of a rabbit or the scuttle of a lizard across the cracked earth punctuated the quiet. Solitude, perfection, or so I thought. The sky burned with deep oranges and purples as dusk fell, and I was just beginning to relax when I spotted movement on the horizon. A figure, distant but distinct. At first, I dismissed it as another camper, though the remoteness of the area made that unlikely. But as I watched, unease coiled in my gut. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if the person were dragging something heavy. Grabbing my binoculars, I focused on the figure. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a tangled beard and filthy, torn clothes. His sunburned skin gleamed under the dying light, and in his massive hands he dragged a large, sagging duffel bag. The bag was stained, dark streaks marring its surface like dried blood. I told myself it was probably just dirt, just my overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The man trudged behind a rocky outcrop, vanishing from view. A cold prickle spread across my skin. With the sun gone, the desert transformed. Shadows stretched long and deep, and the once inviting silence felt oppressive. I locked the RV doors, checked them twice, and placed my hunting knife within reach. The night came alive with unsettling sounds. Distant coyote howls, dry leaves whispering in the wind, and faint, untraceable rustling. Sleep evaded me. My mind replayed the image of the man and his bag over and over. Just after midnight I heard it, a soft, deliberate tap against the RV. My blood turned to ice. Another tap, then a whisper. Low, guttural, incomprehensible. Heart pounding, I crept to the window. Outside, bathed in pale moonlight, stood the man. His face was obscured by shadows, but his eyes, cold, piercing, seemed to glow as they scanned the windows. His hand held something sharp and glinting. A knife. He circled the RV, testing the doors with a methodical calmness that chilled me to my core. Finding them locked, he stopped at the rear of the vehicle. Seconds later, I heard the sickening scrape of metal slicing through rubber. My tires. He was trapping me. Adrenaline surged. I flung the window open and shouted, "Get the hell away from my RV!" The man looked up, his mouth curling into a grotesque grin. "Just making sure you don't go anywhere," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. Then he vanished into the darkness. I was shaking. My RV was no longer safe. I grabbed my knife and a flashlight, slipping out the side door as quietly as I could. The cold night air bit into my skin as I moved toward the nearest trailhead. Every crunch of gravel underfoot, every rustle of leaves felt deafening. I pressed forward, every shadow a potential threat. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a cabin in the distance. A faint, flickering light glowed from within. Hope and desperation propelled me forward. I banged on the door, half expecting no answer, but after a tense moment, it opened. An elderly man stood there, a shotgun in hand. His sharp eyes sized me up. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gruff. I spilled out my story in breathless gasps, describing the man, the duffel bag, and his chilling words. The old man, Walter, nodded grimly and let me inside. "You picked the wrong night to camp alone," he said, bolting the door behind us. The cabin was small, cluttered, and filled with the comforting scent of burning wood. Walter handed me an iron poker. "If he shows up here, we don't give him the chance to make a move." Hours passed in tense silence. The fire crackled softly, a stark contrast to the dread that hung in the air. Just before dawn, we heard it, footsteps crunching outside. Walter peered through the window and stiffened. "It's him," he whispered. The door handle rattled. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The man stepped inside, his knife gleaming. His wild eyes landed on me, and his grin widened. "Found you," he hissed. Walter fired a warning shot into the ceiling, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, with a guttural snarl, he lunged. Walter grappled with him as I swung the poker, striking his arm. The knife clattered to the floor, and together we wrestled him into submission. Walter tied him up with old ropes, his hands trembling but determined. As dawn broke, we dragged the man to the ranger station. The rangers were stunned but acted quickly, taking the man into custody. I sat in their office, sipping stale coffee, my hands still shaking. That night changed me. The desert, once a place of solace, now felt tainted by shadows. I had survived, but the image of the man's eyes, cold calculating, would haunt me forever. Tranquility, I realized, could shatter in an instant, replaced by the sharp edge of terror. The grind of the city had finally worn me down. My soul craved escape, solitude, anything to quiet the noise. So I packed my aging RV and drove deep into the forests of Oregon, to a place called Pine Hollow. Nestled far from the chaos of modern life, it promised the peace I desperately needed. I told no one where I was going. This trip was just for me, a communion with nature, silence, and whatever peace the wilderness could offer. When I arrived, Pine Hollow was even more beautiful than I imagined. Towering pines loomed like ancient sentinels, their tops swaying lazily in the breeze. The sun dipped low, casting a golden-orange glow across the woods. It felt like stepping into a dream, one so serene it almost didn't feel real. I found a spot near a babbling creek, parked my RV, and began to set up camp. The air was cool, filled with the intoxicating scent of pine and damp earth. For a loner like me, this solitude felt like a balm, a rare kind of healing. As night fell, I was cooking dinner by the fire when I noticed movement in the trees. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, rugged and scruffy, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and boots caked in mud. "Hey there," he called out, his voice friendly enough. "Mind if I join you?" I hesitated. I hadn't expected company, but something about his demeanor was disarming. "Sure," I said, gesturing to the fire. His name was Frank. Over the crackle of flames, we exchanged the usual pleasantries. He was an avid hiker, he said, drawn to remote places like this. As the night wore on, our small talk gave way to deeper conversation. Frank had a way of weaving stories, and his words began to take a darker, more compelling turn. He spoke of an old legend tied to these woods, of a hidden treasure buried generations ago. Gold coins, jeweled artifacts, riches beyond imagination. His eyes gleamed with a manic intensity as he described the clues he'd uncovered, bits and pieces that convinced him the treasure was real. It sounded absurd, like a fairy tale, yet his conviction was infectious. By the time we doused the fire and turned in for the night, I felt as though I'd known him for years. The next morning, Frank was up early, brewing coffee over the fire. "Let's see if we can find it," he suggested. His voice was light, but his eyes burned with purpose. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We set off into the forest, following faint trails that grew narrower the deeper we ventured. The trees formed a dense canopy, muting the sunlight into a sickly green haze. There was beauty here, but it was the kind that unsettled as much as it awed. A creeping unease followed me, like we were being watched, though whenever I turned there was nothing but shadows. Around midday, we stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and walls rotting. Frank's excitement was palpable. "This could be it," he murmured. Inside, the air was damp and sour. Dust motes swirled in our flashlight beams as we picked through the debris. In a corner, we uncovered a trapdoor, concealed beneath a pile of rubble. Frank pried it open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air below was colder, heavier. The steps creaked beneath our weight as we descended. At the bottom was a cramped cellar, its walls lined with decaying shelves. In the center of the room sat a wooden chest. Frank approached it like a man possessed. When he opened it, the chest contained old maps, yellowed papers, and a weathered journal. "This is it," he breathed, his voice trembling. Something about the space felt wrong, oppressive. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and writhing in the corners of my vision. I wanted to leave, but Frank was too engrossed in his discovery to notice. He spread one of the maps on the floor, his finger tracing a red circle. "There," he said. "That's where the treasure is." I wanted to argue, to suggest waiting or returning later, but Frank wouldn't hear it. We gathered the maps and set out again. The forest felt more hostile now, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The sensation of being watched had intensified, and every snap of a branch sent my heart racing. After hours of trudging through dense undergrowth, we reached the marked location, a small clearing dominated by a massive stone slab carved with strange symbols. "This is it," Frank whispered, kneeling beside the stone. Without hesitation, he pressed one of the symbols. A deep, grinding noise filled the air as the stone shifted, revealing another staircase spiraling downward. Frank descended without a second thought, and with a knot of dread in my stomach, I followed. At the bottom was a cavern, vast and ancient. Gold coins, jeweled crowns, and glittering relics filled the space, but my attention was drawn to the center. There, on a stone altar, lay a body, mummified and grotesque. Symbols identical to those on the stone above were carved into its desiccated flesh. "It's the Guardian," Frank said, awe in his voice. Before I could stop him, he reached out and touched the body. The moment his fingers made contact, the cavern trembled. A deafening crack echoed, and the ground began to collapse. We ran, the chamber crumbling around us. By the time we emerged, the entrance had sealed itself as though it had never existed. Frank was elated, babbling about his discovery, but I couldn't shake the oppressive dread that had settled in my chest. That night, I lay awake by the fire, every rustle in the trees setting my nerves on edge. I never slept. When morning came, Frank was gone. His belongings were still there, but he was nowhere to be found. I searched the woods, calling his name, but the only answer was silence. By the fire, I found something gleaming in the ashes, a golden amulet, identical to the one the corpse had worn. I picked it up, its weight cold and ominous in my hand. I left Pine Hollow that day, the amulet hidden deep in my bag. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Frank standing at the tree line, watching me go. I never saw him again, but the weight of that night lingers. Sometimes I dream of the altar, of the shadows shifting in the dark, and the amulet, it sits in a drawer, a chilling reminder of what we unearthed and the price we paid. It was one of those afternoons where everything felt perfectly ordinary, until it wasn't. I had been RV camping in a secluded part of the Pacific Northwest, a region revered for its dense forests and tranquil beauty, the kind of place that could make you forget the chaos of the world. After a messy divorce and walking away from a soulless corporate job, I had turned to the outdoors for solace. Nature had a way of peeling back the noise of life and grounding you in its brutal simplicity. That morning had been a peaceful one. Coffee brewed over a crackling campfire, a short hike, and a return to the RV for a late breakfast. I'd parked along an old, overgrown logging road, a spot so isolated that even the faint hum of distant engines felt like echoes from another world. By mid-afternoon, I decided to clean up the RV and organize my gear. It was a task as mundane as any other, and yet, it would mark the last moment of normalcy. As I sifted through my fishing tackle, a rustling came from the bushes just beyond my RV. At first, I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but then something caught the sunlight, a glint of metal, a knife. From the undergrowth emerged a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, clutching the blade as if it were an extension of himself. He was tall and wiry, his clothes filthy and stained, his face gaunt and hollowed out by something primal. I froze. My mind screamed at me to act, but my body betrayed me, locked in place. "Hey, man," I said, raising my hands cautiously, my voice steady despite the panic roiling in my gut. "Take it easy. I'm just camping out here. No need for that." His eyes didn't leave mine. They were vacant yet unnervingly focused, like he wasn't entirely there, or maybe he was too much there. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, and that's when I saw it, the dark, sticky streaks on his shirt. Blood. "Look, if you're hurt, I can..." Before I could finish, he lunged. The knife sliced through the air where my arm had been a split second before. Instinct took over. I ducked, rolling to the side and grabbing the hunting knife I'd left on the table. We circled each other, the forest closing in around us, to full out. The only sounds are heavy breaths and the dry crunch of gravel beneath our feet. My mind raced, trying to piece together who this man was, why he was here. But there was no room for answers. There was only survival. The fight was feral and brutal. He was fast, but desperation gave me an edge. I managed to knock the knife from his grip, the blade skittering across the gravel, but he tackled me, and we hit the ground hard. His nails clawed into my skin as he wrestled to pin me down. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. I twisted free, grabbed a nearby rock, and swung it with everything I had. It connected with a sickening crunch. He went limp, collapsing onto the ground. Blood pooled beneath his head, dark and viscous. I staggered back, panting, my vision tunneling on his lifeless form. My knife fell from my shaking hand. What had I done? I knelt beside him, trembling as I checked for a pulse. Nothing. My mind reeled, a kaleidoscope of panic and disbelief. I needed help. I needed to get to the ranger station miles away. I grabbed my keys, locked up the RV, and sped down the dirt road, my heart hammering in my chest. But halfway there, I saw a figure in the middle of the road, waving frantically. I slowed, unease coiling tight in my stomach. "Help! You have to help me!" the man shouted as I rolled down the window. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice guarded. "It's my brother," he said, his words tumbling over each other in panic. "He's lost it. He attacked me and ran into the woods. Please, you've got to help me find him." A cold chill spread through me. My hands tightened on the wheel. I think I found your brother," I said, my voice low and trembling. "He attacked me too. He's dead." The man's face twisted in horror. No, no, no. He dropped to his knees in the road, his cries raw and guttural. I stepped out cautiously, my pulse hammering in my ears. "We need to get to the ranger station," I said. "They'll know what to do." He nodded, wiping his face with trembling hands. Yeah, okay. The drive to the station was steeped in silence, the kind that presses down on you and makes it hard to breathe. When we arrived, I told the ranger everything. The attack, the body, the fight for my life. A team was dispatched to investigate. Hours passed in oppressive tension before the confirmation came. The man I'd killed was Mason, a recent escapee from a nearby mental institution. He'd gone off his medication, spiraling into violence that led to his confinement in the first place. "You did what you had to do," the ranger assured me, but the words did little to lighten the crushing weight in my chest. As dawn broke, I packed up and left. Driving past the now empty campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something of me had been left behind. The man's lifeless eyes lingered in my mind, their hollow stare etched into my soul. The road stretched ahead, familiar yet alien. I knew I'd never see the world the same way again. I've always thought of myself as a level-headed guy, someone not easily rattled. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, you learn to handle yourself, to walk with your head high and your nerves steeled. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night. I was out RV camping, seeking solitude in the middle of nowhere, parked near the edge of Lake Champlain in Vermont. The spot was perfect, isolated, serene, untouched. The day had been idyllic. I'd spent hours fishing, pulled in a couple of bass, and ended it by the campfire with a cold beer in hand. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, painting the lake in hues of molten orange and deep violet. The water was glassy, so still it mirrored the sky perfectly. It was the kind of peace that almost felt sacred. But peace can be deceptive. I was just about to turn in when I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the woods behind me. At first, I shrugged it off, probably a raccoon or maybe a deer. But the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, more deliberate. My gut tightened, the primal part of my brain whispering that something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the tree line. "Hello?" I called out, my voice firm but measured. No response, just the rhythmic rustling, closer now. I stepped toward the RV, sliding open the compartment beneath the bed to grab the only weapon I had, a baseball bat. Not ideal, but it would have to do. My phone was charging inside the RV, but something in me refused to leave the campsite unguarded long enough to fetch it. The rustling stopped. Silence settled over the woods, thick and oppressive. My ears strained for the faintest sound, but there was nothing. And then it came. A low muttering, a voice just barely audible over the stillness. My heart thudded against my ribs. "Who's there?" I called, gripping the bat tightly. The muttering stopped, and for a moment it felt like the entire world held its breath. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. The man stepped into the dim light of my campfire, and I felt my stomach twist. His clothes were filthy and tattered, hanging off him like a second skin. His face was gaunt, hollowed by dirt and something darker. Madness. His eyes glinted, wide and unblinking, and in his hand, something caught the faint gleam of the firelight. A knife. I swallowed hard. "Can I help you?" My voice was steady, but my body betrayed me, every nerve screaming to run. The man didn't answer. He just kept coming, his lips moving soundlessly. "Look, if you need help, I can call someone," I said, backing up slowly. "But you need to stop, right now." He didn't stop. He didn't even hesitate. "Stay back," I shouted, raising the bat. And then he lunged. The knife arcs toward my chest, but I swung the bat with everything I had. The crack of wood against bone echoed in the still night, and he stumbled sideways, but he didn't fall. His wild eyes locked onto mine, and he slashed again, the blade biting into my arm. Pain bloomed hot and sharp, but adrenaline surged. I swung again, harder this time, catching him in the shoulder. The knife slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. He staggered, clutching his arm, but still, he didn't drop. I kicked the knife away and swung a third time. The bat connected with his temple, and he crumpled to the dirt in a heap. Panting, I stood over him, the bat trembling in my hands. My arm throbbed, blood soaking through the fabric of my sleeve. I dragged the man to the RV and tied his hands with rope, every movement sharp and mechanical. My mind was racing, but my body acted on pure instinct. Once I'd bandaged the wound, I called the police. Waiting for them felt like an eternity, the night stretching on with every shadow feeling darker, every sound more sinister. When they finally arrived, their lights cutting through the gloom, the relief was almost unbearable. They recognized him immediately. An escaped convict, they said. Violent. Dangerous. I was lucky to be alive. As they loaded him into the back of the cruiser, I watched from the edge of the campsite, my blood-soaked sleeve sticking to my skin. The lake was eerily calm again, its surface a perfect mocking mirror of the now dark sky. The next morning, I packed up and left. The place no longer felt like a refuge. It felt tainted, as if something dark had lingered there long before I arrived. Even as I drove away, the image of his wild eyes stayed with me. That night, I faced the kind of danger you never think you'll encounter, the kind that rips away your sense of safety. I survived, but I left something behind in those woods, something I'll never get back. And somewhere deep in the pit of my stomach, I can't help but wonder, what if there's more of them out there?